Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, so welcome to another discussion, interview, Q&A. I'm not sure quite what. This time with my longtime friend, Terry Sejnowski, who is most famous for being kind of an originator of the whole computational neuroscience movement. And I guess, I don't know, I was trying to figure out, when did we first meet? It must be 1984, 1985, something like that. Does that seem plausible?
It was, that's right, your early 80s.
I think
were you at the Institute back then?
Yeah, that sounds plausible. I might have been at an institute in Princeton. I think that I was trying to get a sort of institute for complexity theory started. You were trying to get an institute for neural computation started.
Now it's all coming back, right?
Right. Now, but I did get my complexity institute started, but I bailed out of that whole thing. And you got your institute for neural computation started, and you've been doing that all this time and building all kinds of things there.
That's right. The Institute for Neural Computation was founded in 1989 at UCSD, and it's been going strong.
So, as far as when I first met you, you were already talking about neural networks. So in my sort of model of you were kind of born doing neural networks. But how did you get started in that whole line of thinking?
Well, it actually goes back to my graduate career. So I was at Princeton in the physics department, and I was working at the time with John Wheeler, who was black hole fame, a very, very, very influential physicist, as you well know, Stephen. But
yeah, right. I mean, his ideas are famous for the kind of it from bit. Right. Can the whole world be made from computation and so on? Although he didn't really talk about computation, did he, very much? I mean, did he ever use a computer? Do you know?
I've never seen him. In fact, it was mimeograph days. He would write his lectures out and mimeograph them and pass them out to the class. So it was definitely pre-computer.
But did he think about Turing machines and things like that? Did he know about Turing machines?
I can't remember, but I think you're right that but he kind of, he had an idea of bits, which means that he had an idea of digits, the digital computing, but it wasn't part of his DNA, right? Which was more aimed toward understanding dynamics. Right. And of course, general relativity is the area he was really working on at the time. That was his, before that it was nuclear physics and fission with Niels Bohr. So he had a very broad career, and in fact the project I was working on with him at the time was on black holes, and the question was, what would happen if there was a black hole? He gave me this at my first day in his office, right, his lab. He said, Terry, what would happen if there's a black hole in the middle of a galaxy? So I went off and I did some computing, I did some simulations, and sure enough, it turns out that because of the wind down, because of gravitational radiation, it would be torn apart and it would form an accretion disk. And it's exactly, what it seemed to me a huge source of energy that would then power things like quasi-stellar sources, QSOs, which at the time were a big mystery. And so that was my introduction to John Wheeler's vision. He was looking around for ways, if black holes existed, and at the time it was just a mathematical odyssey, where would you look for them, and what would it look like?
So when was this? What year was this?
Oh my goodness, that goes back to the early 70s.
So that was before like Hawking radiation and things like that. The Hawking radiation was still in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Hawking was at least 5-10 years in the future. But in any case, what really I think was seminal was that my next project was how would you detect gravitational waves? And there was a tremendous amount of excitement at the time because Joe Weber, if you remember that era.
I remember that whole business, yes. Right. The aluminum cylinders.
Right, a big aluminum cylinder, about 10 feet long, instrumented with piezoelectric transducers, which allowed him to look at vibrations, kilohertz vibrations. And he had article in Physirev Letters, which had evidence for, simultaneous detection at College Park in Maryland and at Argonne, two of these bars. And the coincidence was, otherwise it would just be, there's all kinds of background noise. You're trying to measure distances a fraction of the size of the hydrogen atom, right? So this is really pushing it.
Uh-huh.
And so I started working on theory. I figured this is going to be great for my thesis. This is so what I did was I said, what kind of sources? Again, this is John Wheeler, right? Where is the signal coming from? And so I went through every single possible source, supernovae. I looked at black hole collisions, and I looked at anything that you have to require an enormous amount of energy to be able to get a signal, because these are very, very, very weak, right? And I calculated that he was like 3 orders of magnitude away from any known signal, from any known object that could possibly be responsible. And then the curtains came down when he discovered that there was a bug in his program, his analysis program. And in fact,
is that what happened? Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I was right. There is no physical object. And in fact, it was, and I was very dispirited. I sat down and made an estimate. How long would it be before anyone would be able to detect these waves? And I first of all, I zeroed in on interferometric methods, because that would have much higher sensitivity. Of course, it would require a huge interferometer. And I figured, well, order of magnitude per a decade, well, that's about 3 decades or 30 years. And so I figured I don't have, in 30 years, I'll be an old man. I wanted to do something that had impact. And at about the same time, I was taking courses from biologists, in particular, Mark Konishi, who was studying barn owls at the time, sound localization. And I was just mesmerized, because here was a problem which was as mysterious as the universe, which was, how do brains work? And how do we generate this incredible ability to think and to see, and all it was a big mystery. Still is, by the way.
Right, but so I'm curious, coming back to something you mentioned when you were doing sort of the black hole in the center of the galaxy type thing, that you were actually computing, like with a computer. How did you get into? I mean, was that like Fortran and cards, or was that what was the how
yes,
you got
okay.
into
I had decks of cards.
Yeah,
and you're absolutely right. There was a computer center, and I would take my decks of cards, and then I would come back the next day, and I would have my printout, literally, line printers.
Yeah, right. I started doing computing when that was how things worked as well.
Right, and it was slow going, but and by today's standards, these computers were really sluggish. Right, it was like.
And of course, this idea, who would think that one would have like a centralized computer? I mean, why doesn't everybody have their own computer? Well, now, of course, we have cloud computing, which is back to the old idea again. But
well, so actually, I've thought a lot about this, and if you look at any complex system, and this is your business, you need layered systems where you have local edge devices like we have, smartphones, but then you need something which aggregates that information, and then eventually you'll have a cloud, right? But there are many layers in between, and that's the way by the way the brain works. The brain is a layered system, has many components that have to interact at many different scales.
Well, we should talk about that. I want to hear about what I mean. For me, it's kind of like we understand neurons, we understand something about kind of collective views of how thought works, and I'm sort of curious what's in between. But I think that's a bigger story. But let's go back to the historical narrative, because I'm curious. Okay, so we're at barn owls, and
right. Okay,
what made you start taking a class about barn owls?
It was a kind of a curiosity. What I just wanted to know what other people knew. And I have to tell you about how, okay, this is another story I have never told anybody. So all second year students have to take a general exam at Princeton, graduate students in physics. And it was a grueling 1 week marathon where you take tests in the morning, 3-hour tests in the morning and afternoon in every area of physics, right? Classical mechanics, electricity and magnetism, nuclear physics, general relativity, solid state, they call it solid state physics back then, and now condensed matter physics. And, and then at the end, you had to defend an experiment. And so I measured the 3 gamma decay of positronium.
Okay.
Okay. So you had to know all the physics in your head at the same time, right? And so the summer before I took the exam was, people leave Princeton because it gets hot and muggy, but I was up in my office. It wasn't an office; it was a big area in the attic of Palmer Lab, and this was a, just sitting and going over physics was really grueling. So I would go to the library and dabble in things that might be interesting to distract me. And I came across a series of there were transcribed meetings called the Hosea Macy conferences. And it brought together some luminaries from many different fields, including Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch, Margaret Mead, Ralph Gerard. I mean, these were people from psychiatry and anthropology, and it was cybernetics. It was a very, very elite group, and and it was exciting because one meeting after the next, they seem to be getting deeper into this whole idea of nonlinear feedback systems and how that could be applied to society as well as to understanding how people behaved, and then. I was really excited. This is so exciting, right? I mean, you can imagine eavesdropping, because they just basically transcribed word for word what people were saying.
Yeah, these, Terry, those transcripts were recently republished, because I think it must have been, what is it, I don't know what anniversary, the 70-something anniversary, because those things were in the 1950s, right. Mid-1950s.
Yeah, mid-1950s, exactly. And I remember the day that I finished the last volume, and that was it. That was it. So I was saying, this is this 70s now. So there's 20 years. What I wanted to know what has happened since then. And so I started going to the library and looking up a few papers, and I formulated a question. Okay, a very naive question. I said, is the brain a deterministic system like a digital computer, or is it stochastic? Where there's a wide, the signals are fluctuating all the time in a highly variable way, and so I couldn't. If you look at papers, nobody ever directly answers that, because nobody was asking that question. Is it and so I went to the biology building, Geo Hall, and I just walked into a random lab, literally. And I asked
your brain not being stochastic. There was nothing in the choice of random lab. There was no stochastic.
Well, maybe our lives are stochastic, but I want to know how the brain worked, right?
Yeah, right.
So I asked the first person I met. And it turned out it was actually a technician. And also, I didn't know at the time, but I know now, is that it was a fly lab studying fruit flies. And I even know the person, Chip Quinn, whose lab it was, but he wasn't there. And I'm talking technician. I didn't know at the time. I just somebody in the lab. And she said, well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you where you can go to look. And she said that there's a paper by Hubel and Wiesel.
Okay.
And published in Journal of Physiology. And sure enough, I found the paper, 1962. It's a classic paper. It was the first recordings from primary visual cortex. And because it was the first, they had raw recordings. And it was obvious to me it was not a digital computer just by looking at the recordings.
Right, right. But so I mean, in terms of that tradition, right? I mean, von Neumann had talked about, unreliable components and how you might be able to get reliable computation from unreliable components. But the cybernetics people had this question was not certainly a central one to them. But so Hubel and Wiesel. Now I know you've by now you must have done endless actual recordings from brain cells and things. But what was the technology that made it possible for Hubel and Wiesel to start doing single cell recording?
That's a great question, because all advances, as you know, in science follow new tools and techniques that are available to record something you couldn't before. And interestingly, I learned this much later, David Hubel had actually invented a microelectrode which made it possible to record from single neurons. So this was an era when you typically put in a piece of wire and you record from thousands of neurons simultaneously. It's called hash, or EEG from the scalp, which was even averaging over millions of neurons. But that doesn't really give you the grain that you need. And so he invented the tungsten microelectrode. He was able to isolate spikes coming from single neurons, and he, with Torsten Wiesel, discovered that individual cortical neurons in primary visual cortex had a tuning curve that were selective for a particular stimulus, and in particular bars and edges in a particular patch of the visual field, and were topographically organized. This, I'd like to say, this was the recording that launched 1,000 microelectrodes into not just the visual cortex, but the entire brain.
Right.
And it was really exciting because, we're seeing the actual granularity of what the brain was computing, individual neurons. That's the unit of this a cell, the unit of all organs. And it was very heterogeneous, and very different areas have different stimulus features. Auditory cortex, motor cortex for activating muscles. So it was a golden era, for about 20, 30 years. Now here's the limitation that we now know looking back, okay? And it was that kind of, I lived this, so I was part of the whole process. And here's the problem. There are about 100 billion neurons in your brain. By the way, that's about the same number of stars as there are in the Milky Way galaxy. So this is like, it's
right. It's also
the number.
It's also in terms of knowing numbers, it's also the number of galaxies in the universe. So we're very scaled in that way.
Yes, scale free. Okay, so here we go. And here's the problem. What's it like to record from one neuron at a time? Well, first of all, it's going to take a long time to record from all those neurons, right? But it's worse. It's worse. Because here's an analogy. Suppose someone gave you an image, and suppose you had no concept of what an image is. You don't have eyes, but you have an instrument that allows you to record the intensity of a pixel. One pixel.
Right.
And let's say it's a megapixel, right?
Right.
A million pixels. So you one at a time, you have a chance to, and now, okay, so you sample the distributions and you do your statistics and you get an idea that there's a signal out there, but you really can't quite make it out because it's even worse because it's a movie. It's always changing, right? So how far are you going to get, right? It's actually a tribute to the fact that we made progress with this really crude technique, recording from one neuron at a time. And we have gives you a crude idea, but it just shows you what the challenge is. You have to be able to record from many neurons at the same time. And now we're there. It took 30, 40 years. And by the way, the conceptual framework now has changed radically.
Well, so let's go back a little bit to the visual cortex turns out topographically laid out, at least in the first few layers, auditory cortex, motor cortex, those things. I mean, I guess we'll talk about later kind of every other area of the brain and how much we can understand about what's actually going on there, because I think it's a different, somewhat different story. But I mean, back to your kind of journey with the Hubel and Weasel and barn owls, and so
Right.
at some point, so when, I mean, Hubel and Weasel, were they thinking about McCulloch-Pitts neural nets, or did they not know or care about that?
Interesting. That's very interesting. And I never actually did a postdoc in his department, and I talked with him about many things. I never asked him that question. But I know that one of the papers that was very influential in that period was by McCulloch-Pitts Letvin, called "What a Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain."
Right.
And with that paper introduced was the concept of a feature, that the business of the brain is to pick out features from the sensory stream and to represent them. In the case of the fly's retina, it was the cells upstream responded to a small black speck that was moving. So this is great for catching flies, right? So that was the zeitgeist at the time. So I think that Hubel probably was influenced by it, and try to take that to the next level, which is, what are the features that the visual cortex represents, and it did a great job.
Right. So I'm curious, coming back actually to Wheeler for a second, because, one of the things that Wheeler talked a lot about was in the kind of it from bit, the observer as an important part of the sort of feedback loop of the universe and all these kinds of things. Very kind of sort of almost brain-like in the kind of, bringing brains into physics and so on. Did you ever talk to him about that stuff?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we talked all the time about it. He was extremely passionate. And it was all tied up in his, by the way, we're talking about the Planck length. It's like he thought all this foam was going on, well below the level that even of elementary particles, right? This is like, he was going way beyond experiments here. But I remember once in the middle of, I'm not sure if it was a lecture. I think it was a lecture he was giving. That's right. He was giving a lecture on it from bit. And he drew a picture of a big U, the letter U, right, like this. And then out of the side of one of the ascending lines of the U, he had a little pocket coming out, right? A little pocket which was like an eye. And he said, that little out pocket is you. It's your retina looking out at the rest of the universe.
Uh-huh.
And so one of his geniuses was being able to put abstract ideas into very concrete form that anybody could understand, right? That immediately you say, I get it. I see what's going on.
Well, except that particular set of ideas didn't, that was something which didn't really until very recent times get worked through. I mean, that was the universe observing itself and second order cybernetics and all these kinds of things was a
right. Well,
was not,
Wheeler at the time was, that part of his research was considered kind of loony. Well, that's putting it too strongly. It was not mainstream. And nobody quite knew what to make of it, because he was very highly respected and awarded and so forth. But he really went out on a limb. He really did, he figured that I really want to understand how this works, and so he dug deep into general relativity, and he was digging down deep into the fabric of space-time. By the way, one of the most important influences on me when I was an undergraduate was reading a book that he wrote called Space-Time Physics, which was actually mainly about special relativity, but it captured the way that he graphically illustrated things having to do with how space and time get interchanged.
Right.
Which is something I know you're working on now.
The thing that drove me crazy about that book was people with poles running through barns at significant fractions of the speed of light, because I could never figure out what idealizations one was actually making in thinking about those kinds of sort of large scale things in those terms. it's but I'm curious in I know Wheeler, one of the things he did was talk about this geometrodynamics, this kind of idea of
Oh yes, wow.
And that's something that is quite resonates with our current physics project. The only downer for me was I knew that Wheeler had written a book about geometrodynamics. I'd never seen it. It's referenced in the Misner-Thorne and Wheeler gravitation book, but I'd never seen that book.
Okay, I think I may have a copy of it because I remember reading it.
Okay, so I got that book.
Oh,
and I think the reason that the one has never seen it is because that book posits that gravitons are neutrinos.
Well, people can make mistakes.
Yes. otherwise, it's a great book. It has a lot of very good ideas.
If he had asked me, I would have told him it was wrong because gravitons, as you know, they're spin 2, right? Neutrinos are not spin 2.
Indeed.
But, what was in the book were things like wormholes, right?
Yes.
Which now, is kind of very mainstream. By the way, okay, I have to finish my story about gravitational waves. Okay, so actually I was really dispirited. I figured it was going to take 30 years, and so that's why I started going and looking more looking into what's happening in the brain and biology. But along the way, I figured I should publish what I've done, and so I did. It was an article in Physics Today back in the 70s, and and I called up Kip Thorne, another Wheeler student, and I said, "Well, what do you make of this, Kip? This Joe Weber's looks like it's not really going to pan out. What do you think?" And he said, "Well, Terry, I look forward to the time, perhaps 8 years from now, when we discover for the first time gravitational waves coming from supernovae in the Virgo cluster of galaxies, the nearest cluster." And I said, "Can I quote you?" So that quote is in my paper, right? I mean, I just took it and I just said, "Is this you? This is what your prediction." Okay, so
it's only wrong by half an order of magnitude or something. Is a factor of 5 or something in time.
So you'll be amused by this. So I've forgotten when it was 2015 or 16 when the announcement was made. So I sent him an email congratulating him. And I sent him this quote. I said, "You may not remember this, but here's what you said." And he came back immediately, which was strange because he probably had been inundated with thousands and thousands of emails. Somehow he remembered me. I said, "Terry, I was wrong about the Virgo cluster of galaxies, but what's the difference between 8 years and 30 years on a cosmic time scale?"
That's nice.
So in any case, I figured that, look, I had climbed to the summit of physics. And all the problems that were left were so difficult that they probably wouldn't be attacked in my lifetime without new instruments. And if you look around in terms of what was available in general relativity, it was pretty pathetic.
Right. So it's a little ironic coming on to later in the story that in the deep learning business, there was another 30-year span when it wasn't clear what was going to happen. But it's
okay. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Okay.
Yeah, right. But it's okay. So we're back in Hubel and Wiesel and sort of the influence of McCulloch and Pitts through Letvin and so on in those kinds of things. But so you were doing black holes and gravitational radiation, gravitational waves, and then when did you switched at some point to doing more officially neuroscience kinds of things?
Well, I made a fateful decision, which was to take a summer course at the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole, very famous for biologists. It's a kind of a mecca where people come from many different places in the world and spend there are summer courses where you come for weeks, months in some cases, and for introducing people into fields, parts of biology. And also people would set up labs. They would have labs and they'd come and work all summer. And, there were marine creatures. For example, one of the most celebrated species in neuroscience is the squid, because the giant axon of the squid was used by Hodgkin and Huxley, another important team, and they were the ones who discovered the mechanism for propagation of the action potential, right? They were able to figure out the molecular mechanisms. And so
did that not need, that didn't need a microelectrode to get to the giant axon of the squid?
Oh, what they did, it's really interesting. It's giant. It's a millimeter diameter, and most neurons in the brain are like a micron, or in some cases
Why does
less.
a squid have that big an axon?
Oh, it's for escape response. It has to have a very fast escape, and it doesn't have myelin, which means it doesn't have a sheath, the insulation. So it basically, the bigger the diameter, the faster the action potential gets to the muscle, and it gives, it squirts out black ink, and it starts. It actually is a jet propulsion. It puts out a squirt of water. So in any case, yeah, so people came there to do experiments on squid. That was one of the labs that was there. But in any case, I took a course in neurobiology, and it was 11 weeks long. It was the most intense period in my life. I think I only averaged 5 or 6 hours of sleep, because there was something new happening every day. It was really exciting. I recorded for my first neuron in the lab. I can see the action potentials. Actually, it wasn't a neuron, it was a muscle, but they also have action potentials, much bigger than the neuron. I did a electron microscopy project, which was to do freeze fractures imaging of a skate electroreceptor. Electroreceptors are found in sharks, for example, and rays, and they can detect very, very weak electrical signals that's equivalent to a 1.5 volt battery across the Atlantic Ocean, just to show you how sensitive they are. And I wanted to see what was in them. And it was eventually published, actually, because no one had ever done it before. But the beauty, though, is that this was a hands-on course where basically you could really get, and the instructors were all from Harvard Medical School.
By the way, you're talking about the electroreceptors of sharks and so on. The thing you were saying about vision and images and just looking one pixel at a time and trying to find a kind of an overall framework for thinking about images. One wonders with things like electroreceptors, what is the overall framework that a shark might have to describe what's going on?
That's a great question, and there's been a lot of work on that. One of the things we know is that the shark can actually figure out where it's heading by the V cross B with the magnetic field. Velocity cross the magnetic field gives it a signal that allows it to orient. So it has just like we have a sense of vision, it has a sense of the magnetic field around it, which allows it to navigate, which is amazing.
But so for example, there must be feature detectors that you can find for the electroreceptors. So just like we know, yes, we recognize edges and things like that. What do you recognize in electrospace?
Okay. So this when I first came here to San Diego, Walter Heilergenberg, who was at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography down the road here, was doing exactly that. He recorded from different stages in the brain. This is electric fish. Now, it's not a shark, but it's electric fish. They also have electroreceptors. And it turns out that he was studying something called the jamming avoidance response, which is how do you prevent your electroreceptors from getting overloaded by your own electroreception, because they can put out their own electric field. I mean, it's amazing. So it's not only passive, they actively create electric fields, and they can use it to hunt for food, for example, and conspecifics and communication. Very sophisticated. So that he found signals that were able to allow the electric fish to compute all of those things.
So, okay, but going back, we're still in barn owls here, pretty much. But we're so you were. Oh, actually, we're talking about Cold Spring Harbor, and no, Marine Biological Lab. Which is
Woods Hole.
Woods Hole. That's different. That's a different. It's on a different peninsula.
It's that's right. It's in a different state, and it's the MBL also has WHOI, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which is one of the major
It's where they send actual bathyspheres down to,
oceanographic. Yeah.
right. But okay, so you had a chance to actually do hands-on work on actually studying, doing actual neurobiological experiments. Did they also have theoretical courses there? I mean, were they talking about kind of what was known about McCulloch-Pitts neural nets and perceptrons and things like this?
Okay, so let me give you the context for this. Okay, so I was doing something that was so out of the ordinary. I was going from theoretical physics, stepping into a lab, and I don't think anybody else was doing it at the time. There were a few isolated people around the world that were doing neural modeling, but it was very formal mathematical work. It had very little contact with biology. It was all, simple analytic models that weren't very realistic. But the biggest meeting, national meeting, is of the Society for Neuroscience, takes place annually, and 30,000 people show up. And I went to these. Again, it was kind of an experience to see so many people studying so many different aspects of the brain, so many different levels, all the way from ion channels up to psychiatry. I mean, this is like, and I went and tried to seek out the computational posters, right? There's like tens of thousands of posters, literally a sea of posters a mile long. One or two. This is a very empirical field. There was almost no sense or tradition, except for a few of these isolated papers. McCulloch and Pitts was a very, and I actually wrote it was a biography of McCulloch that I wrote a review for, and I thought about this, and it was clear that when he died, and that was the end of an era, and with Lettvin, those were kind of way ahead of their time, in terms of developing network models. They had some very sophisticated network models for invariance, for example, way before convolutional neural networks. They understood that. So
but there had been a tradition. I mean, perceptrons were a thing, sort of a simple mathematical sort of simplification of McCulloch-Pitts networks. And then people were making practical sort of simple neural nets for things like optical character recognition back in the 1950s and 1960s and so on. But I think that was kind of an engineering tradition, probably separate from the biology.
It was, and it was, I think, also ahead of its time, as you know.
Yes.
But be that as it may, the reality was that I was stepping into a foreign land, and I had to learn a foreign vocabulary. In fact, it was not just the words, it was the conceptual framework. Okay, now let me give you an example, just to give you a feeling for what the difference is, okay? So physicists, when they do an experiment, say on an electron at SLAC, it's the same electron that someone is studying somewhere in Russia, right? They're all the same.
So we think.
Well, it may actually be the same electron, going backwards and forwards in time.
I think that was the Feynman-Wheeler idea. I think that one didn't pan out. But
no, I'm just being facetious here. But the difference I'm trying to make is that they're similar enough so that you can reproduce experiments very easily. That's not the case in biology. Every individual is different. Right, that's the whole idea of diversity of genome. Right. But every cell is different. Even in neighboring cells in the same organ, they're different and they're being regulated differently. And so that means that it's really hard to get an idea, a general principle out of the heterogeneity. It's extremely, and so you have to think differently. You can't just. By the way, Leo Szilard, another great physicist, decided to go into biology toward the end of his life, and he said that it changed his entire lifestyle. And why was that? He said that, well, one of the things I loved to do when I was working on a physics problem was to get a hot bath and just soak in it while I was thinking of ideas from first principles in physics. He said that when I switched to biology, I would have to get out of the bathtub every couple of minutes to look up a fact. It's like
interesting.
Because so much of biology is history. It's not just principles. It's historical accidents. The different species came up out of different times and different circumstances, and there are regularities that you see. Like DNA was the big discovery that really changed all of biology. But those are far and few between.
But so we should talk about this more, about to what extent brains are generic in what they do, and to what extent it matters what the details of each individual neuron are, and so on. But let's going back to kind of your narrative, so to speak. So so you discovered that there are no computational neuroscientists, basically.
Yeah. So basically, I decided that, if I'm in this, for a long haul, I really wanted to be able to think like a biologist, and so there was a remark. I was incredibly lucky. My whole career, I had one lucky break after another. So I was working on after the course had ended. I stayed on for another couple of weeks at Woods Hole and taking electron micrographs of this gate electroreceptor, because nobody had ever done this before. So I was going to publish it, right? I was going to get a lot of nice, beautiful figures. And so I'm in the basement of LURB, the biology building there, one of the biology buildings, and in the EM room, which is lights are out and so forth. And I hear a phone ringing outside, and there's nobody else around. So I go out, I pick up the phone and say hello, and the person at the other end said, "Hello, is this Terry Sejnowski?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, my name is Stephen Kuffler." And as it turns out, all of the instructors were from his department. He started the neurobiology department at Harvard back in the 60s. And he said, "I heard from them that you did a great job, and I'm really impressed with you. And I have an opening for a postdoc, and are you interested in working with me?" This is the father of modern neurobiology calling me up, right?
Okay, very nice.
And so so once I got back, I had to get my things in order. So the next year, I went up and worked with him. And that changed my life, because not only was I getting an introduction to neuroscience, but at the highest level. This was a department where Hubel and Wiesel were doing their experiments, and they were former postdocs with Steve. And
what was his great kind of contribution to neuroscience? What was his big thing?
Okay. So many. So he had a genius for actually coming up with the right preparation. That means that experiment, the species and the measurement to answer an important question. Things like, how does a synapse work? And different types of synapses, or for example, and here's a typical thing he'd do. He'd say, there are these glial cells, these are cells that wrap around neurons and provide glue between them, but have many other functions. And let's explore them. So he found that Leach had these giant glial cells. So he and one of his postdocs, John Nichols, went in and answered some simple questions. And so he said, "Well, why don't you take this, John, and explore it?" So he made a career out of it. He would do that over and over again. He would, crayfish, stretch receptors. I mean, he just went over and over again. And let me give you one example in vision. So he was, his first job was at the Wilmer Eye Institute, which is the Department of Ophthalmology at Johns Hopkins. Right. By the way, I got my first job at Johns Hopkins, so he's a legend there. And he's a synaptic physiologist, and so he felt guilty. He wasn't working on the visual system. So he looked at, and found out what was done, and he realized that no one had ever recorded from a single ganglion cell in the retina that projects into the brain in vivo, in an awake animal, or living animal. And so he devised an electrode system where you can put an electrode into the retina and record from a single ganglion cell. Again, very at the time is the state of the art. The one neuron. While he shined a little spot of light around, and he worked out the response properties and shown that they were circularly symmetric, that there was a small region where you can get an excitatory response when the light goes on, and then around it was an inhibitory region where you actually reduce the response, and when the light goes off, it's an off response, you get a burst of spike. So this is this on center, off surround, and then the inverse is now in all the textbooks, because that turns out to be universal in all vertebrates. So this is, right. He did this classic, but then he just moved on, right? And by the way, he said to his postdocs, Hubel and Wiesel, at Hopkins, said, look, why don't you follow this up, find out where the ganglion cell goes, record up there, and tell me what you find. And so this set them off on a journey to get a Nobel Prize back in 1980. While I was there, by the way, I was actually in the department when it was announced, and it was like 1980, 81.
So I'm curious, just a sort of curiosity thing. When you say leeches have big glial cells, squids have giant axons.
Right.
Is there like an inventory somewhere of, is it like location scouting for a movie? You say, I want to find a creature that has something or other.
Oh, no. Okay. There isn't a book you can go to, but there's a vast literature. Biologists, they're great stamp collectors. They love to go out and just find out what's out there. And that's important. You have to do that to get started, right? Just to get started. And I'll give you one classic example from Sidney Brenner, who was another giant, with coeval with
and discoverer of mRNA, which is a famous thing these days.
Yeah, he did that with when he was at the LMB, the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, during the golden period in Cambridge, when DNA was discovered and RNA and so forth. That this is the what do they call it? It was not a principle; they called it a dogma.
Right.
DNA, RNA, proteins. Okay, so and this is at a time when, what do you do for a follow-up? What do you do next? And so all of these famous people at the time were just casting around for a new project. And so Sidney decides he wants a small animal which has a small number of neurons. And so he went through a vast variety of different species and went through the very obscure literature, came up with a nematode. It's a roundworm that has 300 neurons. But it's able to survive. It has locomotion. It does all kinds of interesting behaviors. It's in the soil. It eats bacteria, and that created a whole field. And now there are hundreds, people studying C. elegans. Why? Because it was possible to get the entire lineage of each neuron. In other words, as the neurons divide, as the neuroblasts divide, you can follow their fate, where they end up, and what's their function.
Every cell altogether of the 1700.
Every cell in the entire nematode, but specifically, Sidney was interested in the brain. And then he did something which is really remarkable. In '68, he teamed up with some electron microscopists. And what they did was they serially sectioned, it's about 1 millimeter long. And what they did was traced every single neuron, and they named every single neuron. And that was with the first connectome, which is now a big deal, right? People are trying to do the same thing for mouse brains.
Has it actually been done for anything other than the C. elegans?
Yes. Okay. It was recently done for 2 other species. One of them is the fly brain, which has about 100,000 neurons, and another one is the zebrafish. So it's
is the fly brain like the C. elegans? Is it repeatable? Does every fly have the same connection?
So it turns out that it's not true even for C. elegans. There is some variability at the synaptic level. Yeah, the neurons are more or less fixed, but how they connect up is still variable. And the same thing I think is true of the fly brain, although I don't think they've really done more than one or two so far, so it's hard. It's
Right.
too early to say. But it's remarkably stereotyped. Remarkably stereo.
And we're sure that our human brains aren't.
No. The only thing we know is that the number of neurons. See, what happens is that during development, you get these progenitor cells that keep dividing, and they in each area, right? So they're creating more and more, like the cortex, right? You keep creating more and more cortex, and then they stop. Now, the point at which they stop is regulated by a transcription factor, and that is variable from species to species. In fact, individual to individual, that's the whole point. And you create more cortex, you have more capabilities, right? So that's the difference, is that is larger numbers, and it's not, they're still the same. By the way, in the cortex, they're the same neurons in all cortical areas. It's just, and but they're not exactly wired up exactly the same. There are differences. There's subtle differences in the ion channels and the neurons and so forth. But nonetheless, there's a lot of similarity. So it's a variation on a theme. But actually, one of the big surprises in biology has been that now that we have the genetic blueprint for how you construct a brain, it turns out there's an amazing similarity between invertebrate brains and vertebrate brains. Just to give an example, Hox genes, which is part of what's called the homeobox genes, which are responsible for segmentation. And it's true whether you're a fly or whether you're a human, right? Mm-hmm. And similarly, a lot of the neurons that are developed in flies and in vertebrates also have similar backgrounds in terms of their the genes that are turned on and off and how they specialize and so forth. So there's a tremendous amount of similarity, but also a tremendous amount of refinement. So the very same ion channel will get duplicated over and over again and then become specialized in different neurons in different parts of the brain.
Interesting. So okay, back to so now you're at Harvard in the neurobiology group and doing and were you at that time, were you doing experiments, or could you justify kind of going computational at that point?
I did experiments every day. In fact, I took a vow of chastity. I would not touch a computer. The reason was.
So wait a minute, this is when? This must be 1979-ish, 1980?
Yeah, 79, 80, 81. Yeah.
Okay, so that was right when computers when you could like start hugging your computer, so to speak.
Yes, the lab computers gotten cheap enough so that, and they were coming in, and they were in the department. And I said, I'm not going to become a programmer for these guys, right? I'm not here to program their computers. I am here to learn from them. And that means whatever they know and do, I want to do it too. And so I was very fortunate. Steve Kuffler was a hands-on guy. And in fact, we studied something called the bullfrog sympathetic ganglion, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. It's important in the bullfrog for secreting secretions, in the periphery. And in our system, the sympathetic system is important for regulating functions having to do with relaxation on one hand, and then alertness and getting you all pumped up on the other hand. And in any case, so these neurons, he picked them out because they were huge and they were round. Makes them simpler to record from. And I studied a synaptic, a particular synaptic communication system between the spinal cord and this ganglion cell, which was outside the brain. Which
so I have to ask you, sorry, you mentioned bullfrogs and things, and again, we didn't finish on the question of, when somebody found the bullfrog, were they like going through a bunch of natural history books and so on and saying, hey, has anybody got a creature with a round neuron? Let's go see whether we can find one. I mean, what's the?
I wish I had asked Steve that, because that's a great question. That's a really great question. How did you come across? Typically, what happens, I can tell you because I've been in discussions, is that there are people out there who are like catalogs. who have this all in their head. They know that they know all the butterflies, so they know all the roundworms. And so if you're interested in something, you go and you talk with them.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what you'll find out, is that they'll tell you if they know about particular specializations in specific types of species and so forth. So my guess is that that's how it happens. It's through word of mouth. Otherwise, it would be hopeless, right? To have to sit in the library.
Which organisms? I'm just curious. Which organisms have been your favorite organisms?
Okay.
Forget the humans. We'll forget the humans. Okay.
It depends on what the question is, and one of the beauties of biology is as I said, the diversity of the incredible behaviors. Like, the barn owl is an amazingly specialized creature for sound localization, much better than we are, and it uses it for hunting mice in the dark with echolocation. Right. It can hear the rustle. So, and so if you ask me about, the auditory animal of all time, I would say it's the barn owl, right? But if you talk about, okay, this particular synapse I studied, right? I spent a couple of years at it. Most synapses in our brains, the time scale is a millisecond, right? Very fast. Well, by biology standards, obviously by computer standards, it's really slowpoke, right? As we're talking about, nanoseconds versus milliseconds, right? Factors of a million. But this synapse that I studied, the time scale was measured in minutes. In other words, we would sit there, we'd stimulate the nerve, the electrode is in the cell, we're doing a voltage clamp experiment. It would take 10 seconds, but slowly you see the membrane potential starting to go up. And at that point, you go out and get a cup of coffee. You come back a minute later, and it's just reaching the peak. A minute later.
Okay.
And then you've got to wait 10 minutes for it to come back to baseline. And what made this really amazing was that, unlike all the other neurotransmitters that I was familiar with, which were very small molecules like acetylcholine and norepinephrine and serotonin, I mean, these are all biogenic amines. This was a peptide, LHRH, which is a decapeptide, 10 amino acids. And it was the same peptide that's found in your brain, right, in the hypothalamus. So it releases luteinizing hormone, it's a reproductive hormone. So here's this reproductive hormone sitting in a bullfrog sympathetic ganglion that's responsible for regulating the activity of this neuron over timescales of minutes, which of course is the timescale that the bullfrog is probably interacting with its environment.
It's a chill animal of some kind. It's yeah.
Yeah, it's every species has a different niche. But what's amazing now is we know that there are hundreds and hundreds of peptides in your brain, and we only know the function of a few of them. And very likely they have a and there's receptors for those peptides, the G protein coupled receptors, which are extremely numerous and found, and they're very, very slow. They're slow because they involve what's called second messengers inside the neuron compared to this millisecond stuff, right?
So do you guess that they're to do with the autonomic nervous system, or are they to do with emotional responses, or what are they to do with?
I hesitate to speculate because there's probably so many different functions, first of all, but very, very likely, my guess is that it has something to do with homeostatic balance. So the brain plays with fire, and by that I mean positive feedback loops. And engineering, they're an anathema. You want to stay away from those. It's all negative feedback. That's how you do control. But it turns out with positive feedback, things are much snappier, faster, and you can compute much more sophisticated types of transformations. And so there's all this positive feedback between the pyramidal cells, excitatory positive feedback, and just maintaining a balance to making sure it doesn't go off the deep end. you have inhibitory cells that obviously are in the loop, but also, the whole it has to be really there's many different inhibitory cells, and they all have to be regulated in a different way. So my guess is that in order to maintain that balance without a lot of epilepsy, which is when things go wrong, requires a very, very sophisticated systems for maintaining balance on timescales of many seconds and minutes, which is, I think, what the timescale that these peptides are working on.
But one feature of epilepsy is it becomes a global effect across many, many neurons. So, is that, is the idea that somehow you have to regulate things locally to prevent something becoming a spreading effect to those across many neurons?
Well, it turns out you're talking to the right person. I work on epilepsy,
Okay.
models of epilepsy, and I collaborate with people who study epilepsy in humans. And the first thing that you discover when you start digging into it is that there are many, 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 many different types of epilepsy. This is the same, broken record that I've been telling you about. And there is localized epilepsy and there is generalized epilepsy, and you're referring to the generalized sort. And so the real goal in epilepsy is to try to control that. And to some extent, you can do that with drugs that block specific ion channels. And drugs are really, themselves cause problems, side effects. But at least it reduces the epilepsy, the seizures that can be very debilitating. I collaborate with a group at Mass General that puts in grids of electrodes and records for several weeks, looking for the focus of the seizure. Where does it start? And spread from there. And these are people who are don't respond to drugs, are intractable. And the only hope for them is to find the focus and then to go in surgically and remove it. And so, but in the meantime, I have access to literally 24/7 for weeks of recording. And so I initially got interested because I was interested in sleep states in humans, and I made an important discovery there about something called sleep spindles. But then we had all this epilepsy, all these seizures that were occurring. And so we said, let's start studying those. And so now the latest paper we had, we've actually figured out how to detect the change in the state that happens hours before the seizure occurs. So we can predict when the seizure is going to occur.
So and how big are these neuron arrays? How many neurons are they recording from?
Oh, and these grids are really crude. They're on the order of centimeter, but they're the surface of the cortex. So you have a very high res spatial resolution compared to.
How many pixels? How many pixels are there in the?
So it's like a couple hundred.
And each one is sensing how many neurons typically?
Oh, each one is actually recording averages over probably 100,000 neurons. So okay. it's a very crude way to see it, but
it's one step up from EEG, but it's not single cell recording.
Exactly, and there are whole new technologies now for being able to do the single cells from large parts of the brain. These neuropixels that a single with VLSI technology can record from 1,000 neurons. So you can record now 50,000 neurons in dozens of parts of the brain simultaneously. So the technology is coming along really, really fast.
So, I want to come back to the narrative, but I don't want to miss what is a sleep spindle?
Okay. So when you fall asleep, your brain goes through different stages of sleep. And it alternates between what's called deep slow wave sleep, which is the restorative sleep. You go into that immediately after you fall asleep. You stay there for about an hour. But then you come up and you have these dream states. They're called rapid eye movement or REM states. And you go back and forth during the night, spending more and more time in REM and less in slow wave sleep. But it turns out that in between the two, your brain spends about half its time in the intermediate level of sleep, which has been very mysterious and has been not studied as well, stage 2. And it's when these spindles occur. So a sleep spindle is a very highly synchronous state of when many neurons are spiking simultaneously in bursts in both the cortex and also in the area that projects to it. called the thalamus. And there's feedback connections, so they're synchronous. And they last for about 2 seconds. They're 10 to 14 hertz bursts. And it was thought that, and this is, I collaborated with Mircea Steriad for, he records from single neurons in the cortex during sleep spindles. So literally, we published many papers together, and from, recording from just a handful of neurons, he could record from 3 at the same time, intracellularly. He said that they are synchronous across the whole cortex. The whole cortex is spindling at the same time, and so I assume that was true. Well, now with these electrode arrays that cover literally like, one hemisphere, what we were able to show is that it's not perfectly synchronous, but rather there's a traveling wave. It's a circular traveling wave that goes around once every cycle, about, literally about 100 milliseconds per cycle. And it's a mystery. Why is it doing that? And we were challenged because, these are epilepsy patients, so maybe there's something wrong with their cortex. But then we went and recorded from babies, and they sleep half the time, and they have beautiful spindles, huge spindles, and they're all traveling waves.
So it's almost like there's, a brush cleaning the brain, and it's going around every 100 milliseconds.
It's actually the behavioral evidence suggests that the sleep spindles are really important for consolidating memory. So your experiences during the day are kind of hooked into the hippocampus, and during the night, the hippocampus replays those experiences, and it sets off the spindles, which are thought to be like kneading the bread and putting the experience into long-term semantic memory.
What is the word spindle? What does the word spindle? I mean, I sort of imagined it's a physical object, but what is the word spindle?
I looked into that, and I think it goes back to the days when people were spinning yarn, and making clothes.
Well, yes, I've heard of those kinds of spindles, but what is that?
So I think that the idea, though, that you have something that bursts and is repetitive, and it looks like a spindle, when you record from it, it looks like there's. That's the farthest side.
Very confusing. But so it's an action. It's not a thing. It's a process.
Yeah, it's a process. It's a dynamical process. And in fact, I wrote a whole book on this. It's a 600-page book, monograph, Cambridge, Oxford actually. And we know the biophysical mechanisms. We can reproduce models, detailed models of the ion channels and the connectivity. And it's a beautiful. These spindles are the best studied brain oscillation. There are many of them, but the best studied. The one that has the best, I think, understanding, both in terms of molecular mechanisms and also potentially what their function might be.
But so, I mean, in our traditional, usually in our EEG, we'll have, I don't know, the alpha rhythm or something like this, which is that also a traveling wave going around the brain, or is that?
Yeah, well, okay, well, so now in retrospect, so again, if you go back to what I said earlier about, trying to record from one neuron, how limited you are, you'll never see a traveling wave recording from one neuron at a time. Never. You'll never see it. And so when people record oscillations from one electrode, they don't know. In fact, most people, who were studying oscillations, it never even occurred to them. They didn't have any way of visualizing the array. But now, and I have a review paper on this, dozens and dozens of oscillations at frequencies that vary from 2 hertz all the way up to 100 hertz. They're all traveling waves. What makes them different is the spatial extent to which the traveling wave goes. And I have a paper which I collaborated with here in last year in Nature with colleagues here who record from visual cortex, John Reynolds. And we showed that if you ask a monkey to detect a weak stimulus, a spot of light at threshold, so that they're only getting it 50% of the time, you can show that whether or not they see it depends on the phase of the traveling wave going through that location.
Oh, wow. In
the cortex. In other words, when it's favorable, when it causes the cell to go depolarize, to go near a threshold, closer to a threshold, the monkey will see it. but if it goes in the opposite direction, monkey will not see it, showing that there's a direct behavioral impact.
Well, so let's see. We're still. Let's go back to the narrative of this is interesting, but let's so when Harvard studying bullfrogs,
right.
Then what happened next?
Okay, so the second lucky break, and this is I like I said, my whole life was a sequence of these. I came across, a invitation. It was an announcement that there's going to be a meeting in San Diego on neuromodeling. And so I replied, I said, I'm a physicist. I'm working here at Harvard Neurobiology, recording from neurons. And I guess I failed to mention that there's a little chapter in between Wheeler. So I did my master's degree at Wheeler, but eventually because of the fact that I got sidetracked in biology, I ended up working with John Hopfield. And my thesis was actually on analyzing nonlinear models, network models. So
that was before. So I mean, I ran into John Hopfield back in probably 1981 or so at Caltech when he was working on the Hopfield model of simple neural networks. And so
that's right. Yeah, famous 82 paper. No, this is when he was at Princeton. He was still a biophysicist, and condensed matter, working and making a transition, going to meetings that were organized, for people to come in from the outside. And the NRP is a neural research program. And he would come back and we talk about what was going on. And I ended up writing a couple of very abstract network papers. That was my thesis.
But so John Hopfield had been a sort of traditional condensed matter physicist.
Yes.
Working on spin networks and things,
that's right.
Spin systems and things like
right.
that. And then, but so the things you did about what you're calling network theory, does that mean kind of what graphs do, or does that mean something about you've got this array of neuron-like spins, or what was the kind
of no so this is like before the Hopfield net, and so what I was doing was taking existing network models that people had proposed. There was a famous one by David Marr and Tommy Poggio for Seriopsis, and I just tried to analyze it. I said, what are the attractors, and what was the dynamics and so forth, and I did ironically a stochastic analysis, and I showed that if you look at the correlations, it's simplified because the correlation structure under some reasonable assumptions could be analyzed analytically.
But so in those days, I mean, as I recall, like interacting with John Hopfield back in 1981 and so on, attractors were not yet a thing he was talking about. That came from dynamical systems theory, which was still quite separate from the kinds of things he was thinking.
Yeah, I didn't call them attractors either. I just called them solutions.
Okay, fair enough.
But I had the right idea, and I had some ideas that were way ahead of their time, and now are just becoming, amenable to experiment. But so, that was before I took the course at Woods Hole, right? This is my.
But so were these still continuous calculus type systems, or were these more digitalized kinds of systems?
Oh no, for my thesis was totally theoretical, and I did not do any simulations. It was all analytic, and I used a lot of nonlinear analysis and so forth.
Fair enough. But okay, so all right. So now we're we're still in bullfrogs.
Right. Well, that was the moment when I answered this meeting, this announcement of the meeting, saying that I'm really interested. I've got this background in neural network modeling, but I'm doing experiments. And I didn't know anybody at the time, who was personally. I didn't know anybody. All the people doing these network models, I had read their papers, and so I showed up. They invited me, and I showed up. 1979 here in San Diego was UCSD, and so this is where I met Geoffrey Hinton. he was a postdoc at the time, just like me. I was a postdoc, and he was coming from psychology and AI, and he was convinced that these network models, at the time they were simple associative memory models, so it wasn't advanced, hot-field nets. It was more kind of linear stuff.
Who had organized the meeting in San Diego?
It was Jeff Hinton and let's see, there was someone from Brown, Jim, I've forgotten who it was, but in any case, Jim Anderson. So these were these are true believers. And they invited probably half the important people who were doing network modeling at the time. And this included, Teuvo Kohonen from Finland, and Stu Gieman from Brown, a statistician.
But these all had very different. I mean, like the Gemens or whatever, they had some particular kind of modeling approach, and there were. I mean, at that time, it seemed like there were at least 10 different, completely different types of modeling that were going on.
Right. Okay. So in my book, The Deep Learning Revolution, I try to.
See, look at this. I'm
I tried to,
here we
there
go.
You go.
There's your book.
Thank you for the shout out. But I have a chapter where I talk about what it was like being at that point. And I said that everybody was working on a different kind of a model in isolation with very little crosstalk between them. But they only had one thing in common, that none of these models could solve a difficult problem. In other words, there was a disconnect there, and Jeff's and the meeting that he organized, and just bringing the people together was really almost unprecedented. It was just for people listening to each other, and what they thought. It was more than just and it was actually a paper. It was papers from that meeting, or book chapters came out. Parallel Models of Associative Memory was published just a couple of years later. And it's really fun to go back and look at what people were thinking back then, because that was very telling. And I summarized my thesis basically in that chapter.
But so did that turn into what became the parallel distributed processing business?
Yes. So it turned out that Jeff was kind of the seed for two very well-established psychologists at the time, David Rummelhart and Jay McClellan, who were in the psychology department.
See, look at this. I'm all prepared. That's the
it. I have a couple chapters in that book. Yes. So Jeff and I have a chapter on the Boltzmann machine. So we basically hit it off. We basically both had the same, kind of, intuition that look, the only existence proof that any of these problems in AI can be solved is the fact that nature has solved them. So why not look into the brain? You got to learn something here. We're going to figure out the algorithms. We're going to figure out something. And so, we had this simple-minded idea that if we looked at networks of various sorts, we could probably make progress. But the real roadblock, as you know, in the perceptron was that you couldn't go beyond one layer of weights. If you're trying to train up a network using gradient descent, you're stuck, because as soon as you put in another layer, you have these hidden units, and who knows how you're going to train the weights, the synapses below them, the features, figure out what the features are that you need. And in any case, Jeff and I figured out how to do that with interestingly, I mean, it was a marriage made in heaven, because he had these great insights from psychology. I had the tools from physics, right? The full armamentarium. And, we took, the math we took from statistical mechanics, Boltzmann distributions, right? That's what we call the Boltzmann machine. And lo and behold, there was a learning algorithm for these Boltzmann machines, which allowed you to get past this barrier that that the field could not get past, which is how do you do a multi-layer perceptron? We figured it out.
But so how did that relate? I mean, simulated annealing had been a thing that was already being talked about, or that was a
Scott Kirkpatrick published his paper. In fact, this is the origin of the Boltzmann machine. Okay, Jeff and I were at a meeting in Rochester, and Hopfield was giving a talk on the Hopfield network. And I had just read this paper by Scott Kirkpatrick on simulated annealing. And Jeff and I at the time were trying to struggle with the problem: how do you find a global minimum in a nonlinear network that was riddled with local minima, right? because we thought the perception was finding the best solution, right? The global minimum in energy. That Hopfield had, he defined an energy for a network.
Right, and he had a very linear algebra kind of algorithm for finding that optimal, for setting up a network.
No, he was even more clever. This is a time when the local minima, he turned the lemon into lemonade, and the local minima were local memories that you do pattern completion
right.
on. So but it was just a hop, skip, and jump to think about the global minimum, and so that's what we did. We heated up the Hopfield network, and we started lowering the temperature. And sure enough, if you lowered it slow enough, you got to the global minimum. But something amazing happened along the way, which is that if you don't lower it to zero, but now keep it at a constant in equilibrium and let it come to equilibrium, then it turns out that there's an amazing linearization takes place such that you can compute the weights changes in the whole network, no matter how many layers, by just looking at the correlations between inputs and outputs at every synapse. But you had a price to pay. You had to be able to do that under two conditions. One, where the inputs and outputs were clamped. That was during the day. And then when you let them free, that was, of course, at night when you're sleeping. So we call, this is the two phases, and you subtract the two correlations, and that gives you the weight update. That's the Boltzmann machine learning algorithm. So that we were convinced that we had figured out how the brain works. Believe me, we were just so overjoyed. And Jeff still thinks so, by the way. Despite the fact that, Dave Rumelhart, shortly after, it's like the dam broke. Once somebody says that, no, they're wrong, there is a way to solve the problem, then everybody and his brother now figured out another way to solve it. And Dave's Rumelhart's backprop algorithm is the most efficient. It's just, it's much faster, and we're able to optimize networks now, we know, with hundreds of layers.
But I mean, in this Boltzmann machine thing, the idea of a day-night cycle thing, that's an important feature of that approach.
Absolutely essential, yeah. And the reason, here's the reason. The intuition is that if you're a neuron in the middle of this large network, somewhere in the middle layer, you have no idea what inputs and outputs are, because you're just getting inputs from all over, right? And so how do you know what's relevant from the input and the output, the task, and what's relevant and what's not relevant from all the other data, the things happening? What you do is you go into this sleep state where you have a baseline. These are the correlations when there's no task. And then when there's a task, the correlations change. And now you subtract, because it's linear, you subtract the baseline from the task correlations. And that's what the signal you need to be able to learn the task.
But okay, so you got Boltzmann machines, and I know, by this point, you and I had probably, we'd met, and I remember you were doing the whole net talk thing.
Net talk, yes.
Right, which you were kind enough to publish in probably the first issue of My Complex Systems Journal.
I did indeed, and that's gotten 3,000 citations. It's amazing. So
good. Thanks for contributing to our impact.
Well, I have to say it was turned down by science. So.
Oh, okay, all right. We were the second thing, that was an example of a place where you were learning, in that case, a human-like task.
Right. So that is interesting. The story behind it is that it was a summer student who was coming from Princeton, a graduate student of George Miller at Princeton, who came and wanted to do a summer project on linguistics. Again, very, very wonderful kid, very, very good programmer, and very, very, just like Jeff and me, he's convinced this is going to be the answer to everything, right? And so I told him, look, language is really complicated. Let's find a simpler problem, right? And he said, no, it's got to be language. And I said, okay.
George Miller is the person famous for things like the 5-chunk type thing, and also for the WordNet system. Is that right? Yeah.
So he for two things: 7 plus or minus 2. That's how many things you can keep in mind at the same time, and then also the ambiguity of words. That the same word means 5 different things, and so how do you know what the meaning is, right? You have to disambiguate it with the context. Okay, So at the time, and it's still true, by the way, linguistics was dominated by syntax. It was syntax all the time, word order all the time. This is, of course, Chomsky's great contribution, which has been holding back linguistics for a whole generation.
Well, I think that as we know, the modern machine translation systems don't know anything about that stuff.
No, they do. They know word order, but they don't. It's not the only thing they know about. They know the context. They know that it's actually semantics was the key breakthrough. You have to understand something about the meaning of the word, not just the order. But that's another story. But our story was that we settled on phonology, and that's the sounds that different letters take on. Text to speech. And so I went to the library, and there's a book. 300-page book filled with rules. So, AI was dominated by rules at the time, logic and rules. And what the idea was that there were these regularities, like, how do you make a word past tense? You add an ED, but there's all kinds of exceptions, right? So there's all these exceptions. And so, and if you look at the exceptions, depending on where the word came from, French or German, well, there are rules for the exceptions. No, so it's rules all the way down, but it's you have literally 300 pages of this stuff, and the engineered systems were at the time very, very crude. There's something called Deck Talk, by the way, which we actually bought because we wanted to get a.
Yeah, I think I had one of those, and you saw my one of those.
Yes. Okay, so we said, okay, let's do something. Let's take a window of 7 letters, and we'll just move the word through it one letter at a time. And then we'll train the network with one hidden layer to pronounce to predict the phoneme for that letter. Like A has like 8 different sounds depending on its neighbors, the letters around it. And lo and behold, the network just was amazingly good at being able not just to be trained up on a training set, but then you give it some new words, and it really did a great job. It would do it about, in fact, you can give it pseudo words that don't exist. Twas brillig in the slithy toves that gyre and gimble in the wave, and it would pronounce it pretty much what I would, so it had figured out regularities. It could do regularities, and in the same network do the exceptions. And so that immediately told me that this was a more natural way of representing language. But unfortunately, at the time, these networks were tiny. They were like 20,000 parameters and, a few hundred units. And that's all you could do with, it was a VAX era. You remember VAX 780? So,
Indeed.
I had gotten a presidential investigator award, so I was able to buy a couple of them, of the knockoffs at the time. And without that, I couldn't have gotten off the ground because, it's very computation intensive. So in any case, that stood out, and we coupled it to the Deck Talk so we can actually hear it, right? Because the Deck Talk could pronounce phonemes. We just gave it a string of phonemes, and it sounded okay.
Right. The Deck Talk's intrinsic methodology was to use some of these rule-based systems to try and figure out, you feed it text, it will say things.
Right.
And but so. Okay, so after that sort of a piece of evidence that you can do sort of human-like things using these model neural nets. But on the other side of your life, so to speak, you were doing actual neurobiology with recording from nerve cells and things like this.
Yes, yeah. So I maintain a wet lab recording, and one of the things we did was to record from hippocampal neurons where long-term potentiation was discovered, and we looked for long-term depression. We figured what goes up must come down, and we did find some conditions, but they turned out not to be as robust as other conditions that were found later. But what we had was really nice because we had a kind of theoretical, we could ask theoretical questions and then design experiments to answer them, which was actually at the time wasn't being done in one lab. There was no lab that was able to do that. So another experiment we did, which I was even more important for my thinking. So, and this goes back to the very beginning when I was asking about this question about is the brain stochastic or deterministic? So the question was, how precise are spikes, the timing of the spike, right? And it's debated endlessly. And at the time, the people who were recording from the cortical neurons realized that, well, if you were if you give the same input, you get the timing of the spikes is different every time. And you have to average over like 10 or 100 times to get an average firing rate that was reproducible. So that was everybody thought that the spike timing wasn't important. It was just the number of spikes, right? And so we did an experiment. Zach Manin, who was now here at the Salk Institute, we set up a lab here, and he recorded from a rat cortex. And what he did was to inject current into the pyramidal cell and see how precise the output was, the spikes coming out. And if you give it the traditional biophysical input is a step function and then a constant current. If you do that, then the spikes have, because of jitter, don't have any preferred spike timing after the first spike. But if you, if you record from in vivo from a real neuron in an animal that is, actually alive, and it's fluctuating rapidly because all the inputs are coming in, and depending on what the sensory input is, it will radically, go up and down, putting bursts of spikes. And so what we did was we created a fluctuating input that had a certain amplitude and frequency spectrum. We injected it into the neuron, and lo and behold, the spikes came out with millisecond precision, at random places that looked like they were random. And now we can analyze what was the signal, what was the feature that caused that neuron to spike. And it turns out, interestingly, you might think, oh, it just got a lot of excitatory input. No, because it's when the input actually was low, when it was causing the neuron, which is what happens with inhibition, to go down from threshold and then suddenly pop up. So it was it's a biphasic signature that was making it possible for these neurons to be able to be very reproducible and spike very precisely for hours and hours and hours. And so this paper now, again, has been cited thousands of times, and it just changed my mind. I said, no. Just because, you're not able to interpret the spike timing doesn't mean that it's not used for something and important. And by the way, fast forward, one of the exciting things that's happened now with these recordings from thousands of neurons is that people discovered that this random background activity and the variability in trial to trial is actually a signal. It's not noise. And so what is it? What's going on? What is it? So it turns out that if you do a video of a mouse while it's just sitting there, whiskers are going back and forth, and its snout, it's sniffing, and the eyes are going back and forth. It turns out that the background activity in the visual cortex and many other parts of the brain contain information about the movement of the face. And in fact, you can account for over half of the variance, of the fluctuations in those neurons from the video, and vice versa. If you can record from the background firing rate, you can predict what the face is doing. So it turns out that there's, suddenly what was thought to be noise is a signal, right? And now the question is, why is it there? And that's why things have come to the point now where we can record from enough neurons at the same time to be able to actually make progress.
Well, I think one would, one's general impression would be things that have a certain amount of sort of random stuff going on tend to be less fragile than things where you have just one specific path that you're walking down.
Yes, yeah. In fact, part of the reason why these traveling waves are really important is the following simple, thought experiment. If it were the case that, as everybody thought, the oscillations were synchronous firing of many neurons at the same time, they could not convey more information than one big neuron, right? So basically, you're reducing information by synchrony. Mm-hmm. But with a traveling wave, you have local synchrony, but because it's traveling in space, you're spreading the information out over space, not just time. And that gives you a whole realm. Think about holography, right? I mean, there's a whole realm here of new coding schemes that you can have with traveling waves, which you couldn't if you just had synchrony.
And so coming back again to the sort of historical narrative, I mean, you were working at Jeff Hinton, Boltzmann machines, things like this. Now, Jeff continued working on kind of, with back propagation and things like that, continued working on kind of deep networks for a really long time. And, one didn't really hear much about that. I mean, for me, as a sort of outside observer of these things, it's just like neural nets are really complicated. A few people work on them, but nothing much is happening here. Was that also the impression from the inside, or was it completely different from the inside?
Well, just to show you how the pendulum had swung. So, so I'm the president of the Neural Information Processing Systems Foundation that runs the annual NeurIPS meeting, which was formerly called NIPS.
Oh, you changed its name?
We had to change the name. There was
what's it called now?
NeurIPS.
Okay.
No,
right.
That's a long story.
I remember this story. Okay. I remember. Let's not do that story.
No. Let's not go there. Okay. So, but it was started, literally in the heyday of the neural network movement. It was a ragtag group from many different disciplines, all of which had the same problem, which was dealing with very complex, large data sets, very complex, like speech, problems in terms of, high dimensional problems. Okay. And it looked like what we were doing was going to help, that's what the brain is in the business of doing, right? Representing information by a very high dimensional space of neurons. And so as things went along, the field morphed into machine learning, because it turns out there are other algorithms that could be used for solve the same problem. There was support vector machines that was very powerful. The kernel trick allowed you to actually go beyond, again, one layer of weights and produce more sophisticated models. And then Bayesian networks and graphical models, and these kind of rolled in every 5 years or so. And then,
But that was still, I mean, the field of machine learning, the thing that was called machine learning, to my mind, was one of these black art, black magic type fields, where people would say, much like various areas of numerical analysis and things like that, people would say, I've got this magic algorithm, it will do this and that thing. And it didn't seem like it was turning into something scientific. It turned out, it looked like it was kind of deep in engineering tweaking.
Yeah, no, yes and no. I think that what was accumulating over that time was exploring this whole new dimension, and with different tools and techniques that people were, you're right. It was a lot of it's ad hoc, and there are benchmarks, like, for example, ImageNet. People in computer vision had accumulated, tens of millions of images, tens of thousands of categories, and they were making like, 0.5% improvement in performance every year by handcrafting features for different objects, right? So you're right. It was all going on in a very ad hoc way, but there was progress going on, and people were beginning to understand the true nature of the problem that they were up against. But and by the way, some of these algorithms were very effective for particular types of data. So it's not like they were useless. It's just that they weren't universal.
Right. No, I remember, must have been what, mid 2000s, talking to you, and I was, trying to think about how would we do image processing stuff in Wolfram language and so on. And I was, I knew the Viola Jones algorithm for face recognition and things like that, which was this weird kind of hacky, thing that says, you do these pieces of image processing to get, and I remember, I was trying to understand from you, is there a more general way to do this? Because I imagine we'd end up doing sort of data curation where we had somebody making an algorithm for how do you, some other hacky image processing algorithm for recognizing windows, and another one for recognizing trees and things like this. And,
right.
And that seemed to be what you would have to do in the mid 2000s. That seemed to be
that's the way computer vision. And by the way, Paul Viola was a graduate student and worked in my lab in that era.
Oh, okay.
And he actually had a difficult time getting his stuff published. They didn't like it at the time, but eventually he prevailed.
But that was in image processing. I mean, his work was viewed as being...
it was image processing at the time, and that was, again, the computer vision was very geometrical, and he was taking it off in another direction, which is look at some way of figuring out what relevant features are for particular objects. But what you're alluding to, the story you're really leading me toward, is the following, which is that during that era, neural networks became kind of were considered old-fashioned, and didn't live up to the promise. In fact, someone did a statistical analysis of words that were found in papers that were accepted, right? And other words which are negatively correlated. It turns out neural networks are negatively correlated with getting your paper published.
Right.
Right. So that was the probably in the 2000s, early 2000s, and but now going back to Jeff Hinton, right? So he never gave up the belief that this was the way to solve these problems, and so he at the time was at Toronto, and he had gotten money from the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, to put together a program for studying networks and learning algorithms, right? And it was focused, at the beginning, it was focused on vision, but later it broadened. And I was on the advisory board, so I saw this happen. I saw what happened was that he collected all the people that still believed in neural networks, that not just people in his vicinity in Canada, but also bringing people like me from outside, Apo Hivarinen, for example, from Finland, and others.
I can't do the pronunciation of Finnish names. Is that the same person as the support vector machines person, or is that a different person?
No, it's a different person. This guy comes from Kohonen's group, which is self-organizing maps.
Yeah, that was the self-organizing maps business.
Yeah, that tradition. Okay, but he's a very, very prominent guy. Information theory and nonlinear ICA, for example. Mm-hmm. So ICA is another one of these things that came up in that period, independent component analysis, which has been proven to be a very, very practical algorithm for many different purposes, but it was inspired by the brain. Now, so Jeff had this view, and so I remember we were at a meeting, and I remember them, Jan LeCun, and he was part of that group, and Yoshua Bengio was part of the group, and we were sitting around at dinner. And Jan said, one of my graduate students has gotten this GPU, graphics processing unit, and has been programming it. And he claims he can speed things up by a factor of 100. No, really? A factor of 100? Okay, as you know, when you make incremental advances, even with Moore's law, you don't get a factor of 100 overnight, right? And so literally within a year, all these labs had GPUs in them. And suddenly they could massively increase the size of the network. They could do their experiments much more quickly. They could take on larger data sets. And in fact, that was the 2012 NeurIPS meeting that was held in Lake Tahoe, where Jeff's group, two graduate students, working with which would now is called a deep learning, CNN, convolutional neural network, reduce the error in the ImageNet, predicting what an object is from its image on the test set by a factor of 20%. 20%. That's like a factor of 20 bigger than the average improvement per year in computers, like going 20 years into the future, order of magnitude.
Right. But I mean, previously, everybody who'd won those recognition competitions, those had been kind of traditional image processing, kind of tweaked models. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, very, very labor intensive. And you know, the graduate student can spend, you know, years working on one class of objects just to be able to, you have to find features that are variant to orientation and that are specific to the object and differentiated from other objects. And so, you know, this just takes time and effort, you know, it's labor intensive. And so the beauty of these deep learning networks is that the very same learning algorithm could be used on any problem where you have enough data and you have enough computing. So, you know, it really, and okay, I should also say that during that time, there are innumerable advances, incremental advances in efficiencies and understanding of how to organize it. For example, in the convolutional neural network, Jan LeCun realized that, you know, in addition to having convolutions, you can also improve performance if you pool, if you take features from neighboring locations. And of course, that's what a complex cell does in the visual cortex. And then you have normalization so that you keep things within.
Did Jan LeCun know that analogy to neurobiology? Or he's not, he was a physicist, right?
No, Jan is an engineer, and the answer is it was a period during which he tried hundreds and hundreds of tricks. Some of them worked, most of them didn't. And that was in the group of tricks, and they just happened to be the ones that were found in the brain, right? I mean, you know, it wasn't like he was trying to reproduce the brain.
Right.
Or, you know, that, but the convergence is what's important, is the fact that, you know, he showed that those are good architectural features. And otherwise, you know, people who were studying, Hubel and Wiesler had no concept of what complex cells were good for, right? It was like, it's another cell type, right? And, you know, and this now gives us some intuition about that.
But so back in the days of Hopfield and so on, everybody would say, well, yes, it's kind of inspired by neural nets in the brain, but the ways that these systems are working is nothing like the way brains work. And I think that was still being said at the time when people were doing, you know, back propagation, all these kinds of things. It's like, well, that's a good engineering trick, but it's not how the brain works.
Yeah. That goes way back to the 80s. And I think that what we were doing back to, Patricia and I wrote this book, The Computational Brain, and we pointed out that these were demonstrations, and that's
the last one I have on my table here. I have that one.
Finally came back to it. Yes. Okay. Well, that was a bestseller. It was like 25,000 books, you know, for MIT Press, which is a lot for a technical book, but maybe not as many as you sold.
No. Yeah. Right.
But the message was that we could begin for the first time to create networks, populations of neurons that in a distributed way could solve complex problems through transformation through layers of hidden units, right? And it was at that time, you know, very small and tiny, but it gave us a way to construct the network, and now we could analyze the network and try to figure out principles. And now what's happened, you know, like you say, there was this long fallow period, but then suddenly, bang, you know, it hits a threshold where suddenly you can begin to solve larger, more complex problems in many areas at the same time. And that was the interesting thing. Why is it that it happened at the same time in vision, speech, and language translation, right? There's probably some minimum amount of computation that needs to be done, but and this is something that we didn't understand. It was all about scaling. You need to have a large enough system. And of all the algorithms in AI and machine learning, this one was amazingly scaled extremely well. Why, and how is that? Why is that? Well, it's because if you have an algorithm where you can distribute the load over many, many small processors, right, then it just naturally falls onto massively parallel machines, right? So this is, you know, the marriage made in heaven in terms of taking advantage of the hardware. Now it's all multi-processor clusters, right? That's how.
Well, it's not so easy to do training like that. I mean, that there are many practical problems in that. And
no. This is Google has been working on this, and actually, the latest twist is that what you do is you keep the data in the nodes and you pass the network around. In any case,
right. Well, that's
it's all incremental and it's all about hardware. And here we are scaling. It's all about scaling. And here's, I wrote a paper in PNAS with the title. This was it came from a meeting that the National Academy had organized by some mathematicians. And the title of the paper is The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Deep Learning in Artificial Intelligence. And Stephen will recognize the reference to the Eugene Wigner chapter, which is the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and physics. And my kind of take on it is that all of the theorems and the insights and the intuition that mathematicians and statisticians have come from low dimensional problems, where the goal is to find a unique solution with a small number of parameters, right? And they're good at that. They're theorems and they have algorithms and so forth. They're very good at that. But once you go to a very high dimensional space, the geometry is completely different. And now all those theorems no longer apply, and you have to really start coming up with a new way to analyze the way that these networks are able to learn and solve these difficult problems, right? We're just at the beginning of this. We don't actually understand yet those principles, but but now there's nothing holding us back, because look, we have access to every single unit, every single weight, every single input. If we can't figure that out, how are we going to figure out how the brain works?
Right. I mean, but I think that a couple of points. I mean, first of all, the question of where does deep learning work? Deep learning works on certain kinds of problems that are similar problems to the ones that we humans seem to do decently well on. And it's probably the case that we organize our lives and our environments so that we are confronted with problems which are ones which our brains manage to deal with.
Right.
That is, it might not be and so in other words, it's a bit of a circular thing that insofar as, we could imagine problems which neural nets will not do very well on, those problems will also be not things that our brains would do well on. They're probably not things that we choose to live around, so to speak.
Right. So here's another chapter from my deep learning book, which is that the history of computing can really, the theoretical side can be traced to the actual machine, the von Neumann architecture, right? So we had this in the 50s. We had to build these things, and so all the algorithms are optimized for this architecture, right? And it's been produced wonderful results that have permeated all of the technologies. But now, okay, if you think about computation space, and as you know from cellular automata, right, it's a much broader space. And we're just having now the first explorations of that space, and we're coming back with like Lewis and Clark, and that's incredible, that there's buffalo out there.
Right.
And
although I think one of the key things is most of that space is not stuff that we humans care about or typically deal with.
And well, that may be true, but that doesn't mean that's not useful or important.
No, I agree.
Right. Okay, we agree. Okay, that's good. And I think that the way I put it is that there's a universe of computation, and we have a few algorithms that seem to work, but there's literally going to be galaxies of algorithms of different computational characteristics and architectures, and we're just starting. And actually, one of the biggest boosts right now in this field is, by the way, it went from being called neural networks to machine learning, and now it's called artificial intelligence. Right?
Again? Really? It's called AI again? I thought AI was dying again.
Well, we resuscitated it. It's now, believe me, it's the hottest thing. I mean, in the business world, right? AI is like one of these memes now that people.
I think that's 2 years ago, Terry. I think it was.
Oh, okay. I'm out of.
I think it's a little bit on the down swing?
I'm out of touch. Of course, these things come and go, but the reality is that they're still using these networks, right? I mean,
For sure. Yes.
there's still applications that they have an impact.
No, I think what's happened is, neural net technology, like linear algebra back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it's become a thing that is a component in lots of kinds of methods for doing things.
That's right. That's exactly the way I look at it. It's as if you had a machine language instruction that said recognize the object in that image. You press that instruction and you get back the answer. Right. That's really what we've come down to. Right. But you still have to put it together into a system that actually is.
But so let's come back to neuroscience again. So let's say you say, okay, we now understand something about at least an analog machine code for how sort of various kinds of AI-like processes can work. We know that these neural nets can do things that are like these kinds of things that we see brains do. So now the question is, so we know something about the machine code. Now the question is, what would be laws of neuroscience that you might like to discover? That is, if you were going to do, let's say, for example, in our model of physics these days, we understand something about how kind of things work at the level of atoms of space. But those atoms of space are far, far below things like general relativity and quantum mechanics.
Right.
But what emerge from those dynamics are things like general relativity and quantum mechanics, which are global laws of physics.
Right.
I'm curious, for neuroscience, if you could imagine, you're starting from sort of the atoms of neuroscience, of individual neurons and doing their neural netty kinds of things.
Right.
What would it look like? What would the intermediate layer of kind of the general relativity of neuroscience be like?
So, I mean, this is a hot area right now. That is to say, both in neuroscience and in machine learning. So here's a typical experiment. You record from a neuron, and then you give it a sensory stimulus, and you see how it responds. Okay, well, that's a correlation. That's not the same as causation, right? In other words, can you conclude that because this neuron fired to an edge, that was causing the percept of an edge, your perception of the edge? Well, that's just a correlation. You haven't proven causality. So the real, and this has now become true for understanding, if you want to understand intelligence, you have to understand how it is that you extract causality from data, not just correlation. And here's where we are, I think there's going to be a real, incredible opportunity right now. Okay, so this is that is just coming online, and this has to do with coming up with a new framework for causality. So the traditional framework, which goes back to Judea-Pearl, early days of AI, was that causality can be worked out if you have an acyclic directed graph, right? Where X affects Y, affects Z, but not the Z cannot come back and affect X, right? Because that would make it
a DAG, a directed acyclic graph.
Directed acyclic graph, DAG, exactly. And there you can make progress, and there the way that you make progress is by perturbing the system somehow, activating a node or something.
But back to physics, it's like don't have any closed time-like curves. That's kind of the criterion for.
Yeah, exactly. So that's part of the lore. Now now neuroscientists have created tools and techniques for doing exactly that. So what we can do now is with viruses and channel rhodopsin, we can stimulate with light a particular type of neuron in a particular part of the brain, and we can see how that perturbation affects behavior. So that gives us, that takes us to the next level, because now we can at least, we're in the DAG universe of causality. But I don't think that that's going to be the whole story. And here's the reason. If you actually look at the graph of connectivity in the brain, it's not a DAG. There's a tremendous amount of feedback,
right,
at every level. And what it means is that somehow the brain is working at a different level or scale in terms of how it is able to put together not just sensory inputs, but also experiences you've had and memories that can then lead to hypotheses, basically, that then can be tested. And that's what I mean.
Your statement about DAGs, the fact that the pattern of connections between neurons has cycles in it. If you think about the space-time history of the brain, it's perfectly possible, and in fact will be the case, that the causal graph that represents, this neuron fires causing this other neuron to fire, that thing will be some kind of, partially ordered set of that says, this thing happened, then that thing happened, and so on. I mean, what's interesting about that structure is it happens to be the same formal structure that shows up in our physics project. The only difference with our physics project, although that may even be in our, the underlying structure of space is a hypergraph where you have essentially these sort of atoms of space that are connected. And that's, I think, in, presumably for brains, we can think of the connection of neurons as being like a graph. Is that a true statement, or is it more like a hypergraph? I mean, what is the, how should we, if we, is the connectome a graph or a hypergraph or something quite different?
I think it's too early to say, and here's why. The wiring diagram is really doesn't have the answers, because it's really the dynamics in the graph. Like, for example, if all you had was just literally just a graph in a computer, right? How do you know how the information flows through it? And there's a lot of dynamics. For example, there's a lot of gates that regulate the flow of information between areas, right? Attention. So what is attention? Attention is a way of amplifying some parts of the activity from some parts of the graph to more strongly influence the downstream, right? That's attention. And interestingly, the most recent advances in deep learning, like GPT-3, have been all attention all the time. In other words, you just amp up the attention. And now you're creating subgraphs, maybe partially ordered in some way, that can have much more flexible and much more power in terms of organizing on a conceptual level, the semantic organization of language. So, I think that the answer to your question is that yes and no. It's an important first step, but it's not enough on its own. You need to have understanding of the dynamical properties of the synapses and the way that neurons are gated.
Right. So, I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting in our kind of model of physics, what we're dealing with is, the structure of space is some kind of hypergraph. There is this, local rule that determines kind of effect of one piece of this hypergraph on another. But the space-time history is some kind of causal graph. And, what you're describing as attention is curiously similar to what one thinks about in perhaps in kind of the structure of, causal structure and general relativity and so on. So in other words, the question is, when you're breaking up into certain different regions, that's kind of like an event horizon in a causal graph. That is, you're having a region of space which doesn't communicate with some other region. And what you're making me wonder is whether there's actually more direct analogies. But I'm sort of curious. Imagine that. We've got this description at the level of individual neural nets, and we can compute things with neural nets, and we can make them run and do engineering and so on. The question is, if there was a more global theory, if there was something that would tell you sort of, you'd say, what's going on in the brain? What's the kind of bigger story of neuroscience that is beyond just, we have this specific neuron and this specific kind of cell that, interacts in this particular way. Just like we could say the same thing about space-time. We could say if we didn't have our current perception of space, we could just say there are all these atoms of space, they're all getting updated, they all have these connections to neighboring atoms. It's all very, very complicated. We don't have a global picture that might be something like general relativity. So the question would be, what would be the analogous kind of thing that you could imagine in neuroscience? What would be the, what is the sort of higher level theory? Or put another way, if we even went up from actually a different kind of way of thinking about it, we've got things at the level of individual neural net layers and so on and so on and so on, like in our Wolfram language stuff, we have all of these layers programmed up, and you can kind of construct programs by putting together layers and so on. The question is, if we wanted a higher level of programming, what would it look like? It's sort of, there's both that and the kind of, if we had a global theory that was something like general relativity, what would it look like?
Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit hesitant to say this, but I think that, it's too early for grand unified theories of the brain. I think that, in other words, there are a lot of people out there who have them, and I think the chance of any one of them being.
Well, what's the kind of thing that one of those grand unified theories tells you? What's the kind of, because if we're talking about space-time, the fact that we're interested in gravity and the curvature of space, it's not self-evident. If you were down at the level of looking at individual atoms of space and their connections, it's not at all self-evident that that's the kind of question we would think to ask about.
So, okay, so here's what I'm working on right now. Earlier I talked about these peptides, and so they're called neuromodulators. And what's the difference between a neurotransmitter and neuromodulator is that the neurotransmitter works directly on an ion channel and opens and closes it. Whereas a neuromodulator doesn't do that directly. It influences internal biochemical pathways and influences all sorts of other machinery inside the cell to change the way the cell actually behaves, the way it responds to other inputs. So it modulates the cell. So I think
is that also what psychoactive drugs do?
Yes, by the way, not just psychoactive drugs, but all drugs that are used for mental disturbances. Psychotic drugs, Thorazine, and for manic depressive disorders and so forth. They're all working on the neuromodulatory systems, and all the hallucinogens too, right? LSD. Those are all affecting the neuromodulators. Not a coincidence. It's because that directly affects perception, right? And these neuromodulators are really, they can reconfigure a network. And I'll give you the classic example is the lobster ganglion. It's called the stomatogastric ganglion.
This is another one of these crazy animal location things. Okay, lobster.
It's a lobster. It's a lobster or crayfish. Okay. And it has a stomach that's innervated by this little ganglion. It only has like 30 neurons, so it's tiny. But it's very sophisticated because the muscles are not orthogonal or anything like skeletal muscles. They're all interweaved, and it's a high dimensional problem. In any case, there are two rhythms that this ganglion puts out with the same set of 30 neurons. There's one rhythm, which is the pyloric cycle. I think it has a time scale of about 1 per second. And then there's a gastric mill, which is like 1/10 of a second. So it's like a 10-second period. Now, what's amazing is that neuromodulators can switch it back and forth between those two, the very same set of neurons, with very different phase relationships between the outputs, so that the same muscles are now doing something different with the food that is coming in. One, it grinds it up, and then it has to push it out. So, so this is, and so now I think that what we're talking about here, which is causality, I think is being controlled by these neuromodulators. And so the very same network, if all you have is a graph, you wouldn't know this, can be reconfigured, reshaped to do many different things.
It's not the network, it's the pattern of activity in the network. It's kind of like, it's kind of like a heart or something, where if you poke it in the wrong way, it will go into fibrillation.
Right. So that's it. So that's the organizing the pattern of activity with something that looks like a fixed network, but it's much more flexible, and it has to be robust. And this is the key that most people have left out, which is you want something that is guaranteed to be invariant to temperature over some range. And all chemical reactions variable with temperature, vary the reaction rates. And then you want the system to be able to rapidly reconfigure. I mean, not just
right. But in effect, what you're talking about there is an attractor-like thing, but not with respect to a single static state of the system. But you're talking about something which is, an attractor that has some essentially space-time character to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I mean, my question would be, if you're going kind of so you're saying these neuromodulators are a way of describing kind of the space of larger scale attractors. They're a way of sculpting the space of larger scale attractors, going beyond the level of the individual, what an individual neuron, mediated by neurotransmitters is doing. Right. So it's kind of a slower time scale, larger scale thing. So you're thinking of that as kind of a different level of modularity in the system, where you've got the individual neurons are doing their thing, but this is controlling a larger scale.
And that's the scale at which emotions take place.
Yeah, but I mean, so if you were to represent that, presumably, just like we have kind of McCulloch pits and beyond neural nets to represent the individual neurons with their neurotransmitters, presumably there is a similar model of what happens at the level of neuromodulators. Is that true? And is it the same kind of model, or is it a different kind of model?
Well, we're exploring that right now. We've been doing some simulations. We've used recurrent neural network learning algorithms to actually try to push it and see how to create reconfigurable networks. So that we have a paper that right now is under revision. So yeah, this is a hot area right now. Like I said, this is the frontier, and again, inspiration is coming from biology, and in fact, the tagline on my book, you picked it up. Could you read the tagline?
Well, which tagline? This is
I think it's in red at the top.
Which, this one here, the
at the very top, yeah.
Artificial intelligence meets human intelligence. I'm trying to remember, Terry, because I was involved in pushing you to name this book something reasonable. I think what was the previous name of this book?
It went through so many different names, but Stephen, you are absolutely right. You could take credit. I think that our discussion was.
I think this was my suggested name.
You suggested this.
Right.
You deserve credit. Okay, now it's all coming back to me. You gave me the title for the book, right?
Right, but
I was smart enough to recognize that it was a good title.
Yes, right. Okay, so artificial intelligence meets human intelligence. Okay, so this is your concept for kind of the theory of what deep learning is about.
It's not just deep learning. It turns out that reinforcement learning is another good example, right? It actually is a part of optimization theory, right? Engineers have used it for quite a while. It came temporal difference learning came from Rich Sutton, who was an engineer, and now we think that this is the leading theory for a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, and the dopamine neurons. We know, and this has been shown over and over again, are representing something called reward prediction error. That means they respond not just to the reward, but whether it's the reward that you expected. And if it's what you expected, you don't change any strengths of any synapse. But if you get more or less, then you reconfigure the synapses. So that's but the reinforcement learning system by itself is very slow and kludgy, and without the deep learning part for the representation, it's not very powerful. So the idea, though, is that we have different parts of the brain that have been different algorithms that work together to solve the difficult problems. And I think that we're getting inspiration from those different parts of the brain, but there are still major mysteries that haven't been like the ones you're alluding to, like causality, which I think we're just beginning to formulate.
But I mean, we can imagine various different kinds of descriptions. We can imagine a description at the level of individual neurons and neural networks and sort of the deep learning story. We can imagine a description at a sort of a more symbolic level of we've got some kind of human understandable language level description. I mean, this is the story of my life of
Okay. So look. Okay, this is an age-old issue. You know, top down or bottom up. And let's look at the history of AI. It was born in the 50s at the same time as the computer. So what do? What kind of algorithms do you look for? Well, you look for algorithms that the slow computers can do really well, like logic. That's what they do really well, and rules, right? So you look in the universe of logic for solutions. But what solutions are you looking for? Well, you're using your intuition about how is it that, you know, language is done. Well, your intuition tells you that it's all about symbol manipulation, right? I mean, it's very plausible that, you know, that these symbols are being manipulated by their order, and they somehow represent things that are conceptual things that are abstract and so forth. And you know, that's kind of it's called folk psychology. You know, it's like, you know, it's a story we tell ourselves because it's a simple story and it kind of explains it to first order. But the reality is that with that kind of first order model, you can't get anywhere in the real world, because the real world is very complex with many different dimensions and factors and interactions, very high order. And you need to have a system that can represent that. And I think that that's really the problem, is that if you use your intuition about anything, there's no reason why nature should allow you to understand how the brain works, because that's not going to help you. All you need to know is what the right behavior is. And if you can do that and make a story up about why you did it, that's all you need to survive.
Right. But I think, I mean, you know, the way I see it, in this sort of computational universe of possible programs, most do, as I would say, computationally irreducible things. Most do very complicated stuff. Those, and that's a lot of what nature uses to do the things it does, including things inside brains. But we humans carve out for our activities a small corner of what is possible in the computational universe that has the feature that it has a certain amount of computational reducibility. So some things about what happened in our world are predictable. And if, you know, we could try and live at the level of computational irreducibility, then nothing would be predictable. We would never have invented science. Right. We wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah. Okay. And so how do you get to that? So you're asking the question of, okay, well, how are we going to find out how that's done, right? That's your question, I think.
Well, right. No, I think that we, it's like an attractor kind of thing. We, you know, given our sensory data, we can, we can recognize certain regularities of the world, which we then make use of in engineering. We build technology around the regularities that we've recognized. Then perhaps, you know, in biological evolution, we build more sensory apparatus that makes use of the things that we've been able to use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're kind of carving ourselves into some corner of this sort of computational universe of possibilities.
Right. And how is that done? How does the brain do that?
Well, what do you mean? Well, the question is, we are given a brain that has a certain structure. That structure allows us to recognize certain reducibilities in the world. There might be quite other reducibilities that a brain of a completely different structure would recognize. Like, for example, we might, at a more mathematical level, we might recognize periodicity. And, but there might be some completely different structure, nested structures, fractal structures, something like that, which will be recognized by a different kind of thing. But so, we have brains that recognize certain regularities. We build our world around the regularities that our brains recognize. And no doubt in evolutionary biology, those regularities that we have been able to make use of, we then produce brains that are better at dealing with those kinds of regularities and so on. So I think, my view would be that the thing that it's kind of like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We, in other words, we have a brain that can deal with certain kind of regularities. So we set up our world to have those kinds of regularities. So the fact, you talk about the unreasonable effectiveness of neural nets, in a sense, my argument would be the reason they seem unreasonably effective is because the things in our world are things we have constructed things in our world for which those methods work. And it's the same reason, by the way, it's the same reason that Wigner thought mathematics was unreasonably effective in physics, because physics was basically defined to be the area in which mathematics worked. When you have turbulence and things like this, it's an area where mathematics didn't work so well, right. And where, and that was like, oh, that was not taught in physics. And so right. My claim would be, but I think that still doesn't address the issue of, you're talking about kind of the symbolic paradigm for things. And, I think that since I've spent a large part of my life building a computational language that is a kind of symbolic representation of the world, why is that a good idea? Why isn't it just neural nets all the way down? Well, I think the answer is that it's, what elevates one beyond the level of what allows one to build a taller tower is having something that has kind of where you have this actual structure that you can build on top of, so to speak. Whereas in the case of, in other words, one's taking with this kind of symbolic approach, one is abstracting certain aspects of the world that we are capable of building in a sort of taller tower. And the question would be, when we look at neural nets, we can look at what you were describing as kind of the folk psychology of things. We can say, we're going to describe the world symbolically using things that we recognize at a sort of psychological cognitive level. But now if I want to go downwards and I want to say, I want to actually describe how brains work, not at the level of individual neurons, but at a level that's sort of intermediate between the sort of the cognitive level of how I make up my symbolic language and the level of individual neurons. What's in between? What's the description of, right. If you have a deep learning system and you say, oh, I can, I've done this a zillion times in our fine language, you can just take some standard, image recognition network and you can break it halfway through and you can see what was it thinking halfway through the network.
Right.
And it looks like garbage. And the question is what?
Right. Okay. Well, here's a place where you could help us, which is that you've been able to make the transition from the substructure, all the fine details, to a level where causality simplifies or is capable of reorganizing the larger scale structure. Okay, how did that happen? Maybe there's something similar that could happen with neurons, right? If we use the same tools that you're using.
Right. So yeah, in the case of physics, we have now an understanding of how does general relativity arise from the apparently uncorrelated sort of just, these little pieces of space are being rewritten in a certain way. We know that there's this, in fact, I've just been writing about this myself, what I'm describing as the multi-computational paradigm of kind of this large number of sort of independent events that update a system. And the question is, how do you make sense? Okay, so the usual way of thinking about, like, let's say a cellular automaton, the thing has some state, some sequence of black and white cells. It has some rule that say how to make the next state. And what you get is essentially this linear sequence in time of, this how the state of the system evolves. That sequence can be computationally irreducible. It can be the case that you can't know what the end result of that sequence is without following every step. But fundamentally, time is still a one-dimensional thing where you're going from one state to the next and so on. In what we're doing in physics, one of the things that happens is we have this notion that there are these updates that can happen, and these updates can happen sort of anywhere they choose to happen. And that means you don't get a single thread of time. You get these things that I've called multi-way systems, where you've basically got this kind of branching and merging sequence of threads of time. So you've got this kind of interwoven sequence of threads of time. And one feature of that is, if you say, well, what happened in the system at time t equals whatever? The answer is there's no definite thing to say, because there are many different threads of time that are being followed. And to say what happened, you basically have to imagine an observer, and you have to sort of define a reference frame, and you have to say, how is somebody going to take all these different threads and knit them together? And so, in fact, this comes back to what we were talking about with Wheeler and kind of observation of the universe and so on. In this multi-way system paradigm, there is no choice but to have an observer involved. And it turns out that, the thing we found is that, again, it's a little bit more elaborate in the physics case, and I haven't quite unraveled how it will work in other cases. When the observer is themselves embedded within the system, if the observer, the key thing about the observer for physics is that the observer sequentializes time. That is, there are many fingers of time that are going on. There are many, there's branching and merging network of possible histories, but you say the observer just has the point of view that time is sequentialized. So the observer just imagines that everything is just flowing in one sort of stream of time. As soon as you say that, you inevitably get general relativity. So the question would be, for brains, is there an analogous kind of thing? You've got all these neurons, and they're all getting updated, and you could, in an actual brain, in an actual particular instance of a brain, there is a particular sequence of firings that happen in the brain. But you can imagine, in your models of brains, I suspect you imagine that these neurons could be firing at different times. They just have certain environment that causes them to fire or not fire. There's a certain, and so you can imagine, again, this is descending into a level of technical detail about kind of, the construction of multi-way graphs and the construction of causal graphs and so on. But the question about the whole thing is, if you want to say collectively, what can you say about brains? Right? You've made, you've talked about things like traveling waves and so on, which are collective effects on brains at the level at a very kind of coarse, non-cognitive level. And the question is, if you are going to talk about things at a more, at a level of sort of deriving psychology from neurons, what would that look like? What could you imagine? Could you imagine a theory like if somebody said n years in the future, well, actually, general relativity applied to the brain? What would that look like? What kind of a thing would you say? That is, it's similar to, for example, I've been thinking about how these various ideas we have in physics, how that formalism applies to different fields. So, for example, one I've been thinking about is economics, where a key question in economics is, why is it reasonable to say that things have a value? As opposed to just saying there are all these little transactions that are happening between different agents. You say that's well described by saying the value of gold is this. It's not obvious that that would be the case. So my question is, in brains, what would be the analogous kind of collective statement that you could imagine making that goes beyond just the level of, there are these individual things happening with individual neurons and so on? And what would be the, and I guess I'm curious. I know that, I haven't really followed, and I have to ask you about, there are people we both know, like Jeff Hawkins and so on, who has various sort of somewhat higher level theories of how brains work, which I don't know anything about. I've never understood them. Are there any of these kind of emerging sort of higher level theories of how neural nets / brains work that one should be thinking about?
So what I think you've arrived at is called consciousness.
Well, right? I think.
In other words, it's the high level description we have of something that happens in the world and that we're conscious of, that we can put into words, right? That's a kind of a crude way of saying it, but I think there are theories of consciousness that are out there. There's one that has to do with complexity that.
But what will be a thing? See, the thing that bothers me. So, for example, I've thought a bit, as you know, recently about consciousness, and I am at best an applied consciousness researcher, so to speak, in the following sense, that the question that I have is, why do we perceive the laws of physics that we perceive? So in the case of statistical mechanics, you've got a bunch of gas molecules bouncing around in a box, but yet our perception of what happens in thermodynamics is something about gas laws, pressure and temperature and things like that. It is not self-evident that we would perceive a gas at that level. We might perceive it at the level of individual molecules, but because of the way that we sort of coarse grain things, we perceive it in terms of pressure and temperature. And that means we believe that the laws of thermodynamics work and all kinds of other things. So my use of quotes consciousness is to say, what attributes do we have that cause us to conclude that things like space exist? And I think the answer to that is what you need is basically two attributes: computational boundedness of the observer and sequentialization in time. So in other words, once you have those two attributes, you just like in the case of statistical mechanics, having the idea that you do coarse graining gives you the second law of thermodynamics, gives you the gas laws, things like this. So similarly, just knowing those very basic things about quotes consciousness, that it's computationally bounded and that sequentializes time, imply that we will perceive the laws of physics that we perceive. Now, maybe there are finer, to say you sequentialize in time and you're computationally bounded, many things beyond brains will do that. I mean, it might not be, we could imagine the alien intelligence that doesn't do that, but many things that aren't just brains do that. Now, maybe when we think specifically about brains, there are more attributes that we should be imagining than just sequentialization in time and computational boundedness. And the question would be, what's the broader category that talks about theories of brains as opposed to merely theories of consciousness as far as you need it to get physics?
So do you know Don Hoffman?
I do not.
He has a book. You should take a look at it. I think I have it here somewhere. No, he has an interesting thought along those lines, which is the following: that evolution gave us sensors that help us survive, right? Mm-hmm. And it may well be that there's a lot more going on out there which we don't have sensors for because it doesn't matter for survival.
Absolutely. The individual configuration of molecules in a gas is not something that we make use of. We only make use of overall, in a fluid, for example, we care about the water is flowing in more or less this way. We don't have sensors and don't care about the more detailed microscopic motions. So yes, I agree that I don't think it's necessarily the case that we live in the only attractor for how you can exist in the world.
Well, that then is what he explores, which is that what other realities could there be? But I like the way that you have set up the problem, which has to do with constraints that are needed and maybe are inevitable, right? If you're going to be able to perpetuate life as we know it.
Right, but I think the key thing in my way of thinking about this is there's, the generic cellular automaton or something has computationally irreducible behavior. You can't predict what it's going to do other than just by running it and seeing what happens. And the question is, how do we find sort of pockets of reducibility in the world where we can operate in such a way that we can predict something about what's going to happen? But I guess my question would be, if we're trying to describe brains at the level of individual neurons, I'm sure that there's plenty of computational irreducibility in brains. Yet there is some collective thing that happens in brains that is somehow predictable and useful, so to speak.
Right, right.
And so my question is, when we see that level of brains that is beyond the computationally irreducible, that is these layers, these pockets of reducibility. In physics, the thing we've realized is the pockets of reducibility that we know, they're basically three: statistical mechanics, general relativity, and quantum mechanics. And now we actually understand how all three of those, they're actually all pretty much the same. They all work the same way. And they're all the fact that, in statistical mechanics, the validity of the second law of thermodynamics is a consequence of the fact that we don't trace how each individual molecule moves. We only know these collective facts about it. That's why we think entropy increases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, what physics has done is to identify these pockets of reducibility in what would otherwise be a completely computationally irreducible sort of, fabric of what's going on. Now, the question would be, in the case of brains, it's pretty clear that we're making use of, in the way that brains operate. Okay, when we see our image recognition system, our object recognition system running, we can look at it down at the lowest level. We can see what's happening to the individual neurons, whether it's in an artificial neural net or a real neural net. And that's very complicated, and it's kind of a computationally irreducible story. But yet, the overall picture of, I don't know, the things evolving to some attractor or some such other thing, there seems to be an overall picture that is beyond the level of just those individual neurons. Now, maybe the only thing about that picture is just to say there are attractors. There's some, maybe that's the best we can do, is to say things work. But I think that's a rather static, the fact there are attractors doesn't get you kind of dynamic reinforcement learning-y type things. That's just a fairly static statement. But my question would be, I would say one thing that maybe is a thing that's come out of the neural net world, is one sort of generic fact about the brain is this idea of attractors and basins of attraction. That's something that transcends the details of individual neurons and is a robust general idea about how brains might work. So, my question would be, is there another level of that, perhaps a more dynamic level?
So it turns out that what those issues that you just raised are ones that are being analyzed. And by the way, way beyond the static attractors, now we have line attractors, where there's a whole line of stable network configurations, right? Say a circle. That's been found in the brain. Interestingly, even in the fly brain. And then there are dynamical attractors. That is to say, if you record from enough neurons, say in the hippocampus, well, a mouse is doing some task, like making a decision to go right or left. I won't go into the details. It turns out that even though individual neurons are doing different things, if you look at the subspace that those neurons are going through over time, they're very constricted to a little tube.
So this is like effectively dimension reduction. You record from all these neurons and then you do some kind of dimension reduction.
Right.
To try and see where the thing lives in some space.
Yeah, and the beauty is that on any given trial, it's going to take a different trajectory through that tube. And if you were just looking at the neurons, you wouldn't know this. You would just say that the neurons are doing different things on different trials, right? But somehow, if you have a big enough picture of the whole space, then you can see that the brain is carving subspaces within that much larger numbers of dimensions where the behavior lives. The behavior is a very restricted subspace.
Okay, but so one way of saying that is, we're talking about symbolic versus neural type things. Basically, as soon as you say there are attractors, that's kind of symbolicizing the underlying neural net idea. Right. And so now the question is, when you have that structure, so you've got the individual neurons and they're doing their thing, and what you're saying is the description of the brain might be purely at the level of the attractors, not at the level of the individual neurons. Now, the question will be, what's the analogy of that? In statistical mechanics, I suppose, the analogy would be, you don't care about the individual molecules, you only care about the aggregate fluid velocity or something. And this is a little different in the case of attractors. You're saying that you're not saying that the thing you might have said, which people talked about, in sort of the early days of thinking about neuronal networks and things, you might have said, all we'll do is look at the average activity. And we'll say, the average activity is this, and we can get, waves from that and all kinds of things like this. That level, which would be the level that we would do in statistical mechanics, where we would say, let's not look at the individual velocity vector of every molecule, let's only look at the aggregate velocity vector. That's kind of the analog of saying, let's not look at the individual activity of every neuron, let's just look at the average activity. So that would be kind of level 0 of what people were doing in neurophysiology and so on.
Right.
Now, what you're saying is, look at not at the level of just aggregate activity, but at some attribute, which is essentially the dimension reduction of the actual neuron firing pattern. And you're saying, instead of doing the reduction, instead of just saying, take the average activity, that's the coarse-grained measurement. Instead, you're saying, imagine a different kind of coarse-grained measurement where the coarse graining is done by some dimension reduction method, and where that is your way of describing what's happening in the system. And so that would be, so then then the obvious question would be, just like you could derive PDEs or something for the average activity, what would be the type of theory that you would get for this kind of, for the kind of, the dimension reduced representation of the brain? What will be the aggregate theory of the dimension reduced structure of the brain? What would you imagine is kind of the, so in other words, you've got your tube of your mouse in, because what you're effectively describing there is you're describing that in some kind of abstract conceptual space. You're not saying the average velocity vector, you're saying this much more complicated dimension reduced thing where there is an abstract that it's in an abstract space. And now the question is, what is the, what's the dynamics of those collective things in that abstract space?
So the part of mathematics that comes closest to describing what we've been saying in words is manifold embedding. So I take it that there's, a whole area where people have come up with descriptions, mathematical descriptions for this kind of.
Well, assuming you have a manifold, which is not obvious. I mean, the fact that, what you're saying is, if this dimension reduction thing, if the aggregate variables can be described as things that live in manifolds, then so be it. That's not self-evident that would be the case. It could still be true. I mean, for example, in the case of in what we've looked at in our physics project, the case of space-time, yes, you have manifolds. The case of quantum mechanics, you have Hilbert spaces, things are more complicated. It's not a traditional kind of manifold-like structure that's locally like Euclidean space. So it's not, I think, self-evident that an aggregate description of something like this should be, I mean, space in its Euclideanized form is something that happens to be a good description of physical space. It's not at all obvious that would be a good description of neural space, so to speak. I mean, and it might be that neural space is more like some kind of Hilbert space type thing, or some other structure that doesn't have kind of this specific idea of manifolds. I mean, once you have manifolds, I agree, you have PDEs and things like this. But I suppose the question would be, you're saying you've done dimension reduction, you've got some kind of pseudo-symbolic description. So one question would be, when you do that dimension reduction, do the things that you dimension reduce to, are they things for which we have a sort of symbolic linguistic description of what's going on? Or are they new kinds of constructs that we haven't yet had science to talk about?
Not clear, because this is what I'm describing to you is research that's been done just in the last couple of years. And these new dimensionality reduction methods are very advanced. You can't just PCA it to get them. You have to basically patch it together from local linear embeddings. So it's a complicated business. But,
right, but as soon as you're doing local linear embeddings, you're assuming manifolds, basically.
Yeah, but we're absolutely assuming a manifold, and it seems to hang together. Whether that's the best description, who knows? It's early days, but I think it strikes me as explaining a lot of mysteries. And if it works out, then I think it will be something that we could build on.
But let's play back a different thing. So you said, one of the things that was discovered in the sort of the Hubert Wiesel time was the feature, the fact that our visual cortex picks out certain features of a visual scene. Okay, so the question is, you're looking at the innards of a deep learning neural net, and it's picked out various kinds of features and so on. The question is, is there a form of sensory, a form of perception that is the relevant perception for understanding the innards of a neural net? Just like that electroreceptive shark or whatever is sensing certain aspects of the world that are different from the ones that we're sensing, we are not usually interested in the innards of how brains work. But were we to, do neuroscience, for example, we might be interested in the innards of how brains work. And the question would be, what are the feature detectors that the evolved neuroscientists should have, so to speak, that give you sort of the relevant features for describing the innards of how brains work? What would those, and what you're saying is these dimension reduction techniques are effectively are attempting to be the feature detectors for the evolved neuroscientists, so to speak.
Right, right.
And so it's not obvious that those feature detectors, I mean, the question would be, is there something that can be said how would you characterize those feature detectors? Are those feature detectors things that is it the case, for example, with brains? Here's a possibility. It could be there are 5 new ideas. Okay, when we think about vision, there are things like, we recognize edges, we deal with center surround cells, we have blobs, there's a certain number of things that we would describe, even in human language, to say, what is the scene like? It has these straight edges, it has this geometrical structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a limited lexicon with which we describe visual scenes. So it could be the case, perhaps, that if we knew just 5 new concepts, that we could describe the typical innards of a typical, heavily, trained neural net. And is that a plausible thing? And if that was the case, what might those concepts be? I mean, because in other words, it's not self-evident, as you were mentioning, for example, for the shark, it's not, for us with the visual with visual scenes, things like edge detectors make sense because our world consists of objects that have edges. It is not self-evident that our world should consist of objects that have edges. I mean, the trees behind you don't have very convincing edges in many ways. We can approximate them roughly by edges, but that's, so in other words, we've, for our typical built environment, so to speak, the concept of having an edge detector works pretty well. If you're a shark, it's not obvious that the edge detector thing is necessarily the point. If magnetic fields are what you're sensing, edges may not be the story. So my question would be, if, from your sort of life in neuroscience, so to speak, if you were to imagine what are the edges of kind of, what are the features that you would think of extracting when you look at the innards of a deep learning neural net and what it's doing, which are potentially analogous to the things you've been doing single cell recording on in brains and so on, perhaps. What might be, can you guess anything about what might be the kind of descriptive concepts, the analog of edges in, sort of the innards of how brains are working?
Well, I think starting with deep learning networks is giving us a toehold. So, real brains are so highly evolved that, it's hard to really sort out the kind of the principles and essential parts from a lot of details that are just there to make it work. Although I think all of that is going to ultimately be important for understanding it. But at least in our deep learning networks, we can begin to make progress. And I can tell you a couple of things. So David Cicillo did a really nice analysis. He took simple tasks having to do with accounting. I'm not going to go into the details, but and parity and things like that, and trained up recurrent networks to to do them, right? Simple decisions on the basis of inputs coming in sequentially. And it turns out that each network was trained up and had different connections, right? And then what he did was analyze the dynamics in just the way you described. And it turns out that all of these networks had the same number of attractors in them. And when you looked at the activity pattern, it was always between the attractors in the same order in all the different networks, right? So that gives you a geometric description of a class of simple problems where where there's a universality here, where you transcend the details of individual neurons and can describe the algorithm that was discovered as this dynamics between different waypoints in the network to get you to the right output. So that may be a beginning, right? That's kind of the first step.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
I mean, so one of the questions would be, like in our symbolic language, that there are particular kinds of things one thinks about doing. You have functions, you compose functions together, things like that. One of the things that is a very practical issue for us right now is, we have this way of very nice symbolic way of describing neural nets in terms of essentially graphs that define the connection of layers and things like this. The question is there a higher level of description that is more like kind of our traditional symbolic language, or are we, kind of what? I mean, the thing I'm sort of grappling with is, what is functional programming like for a neural net kind of thing? That is, what are the kinds of symbolic constructs that get you further down into the, not to the machine code of individual neurons, but what are the kind of larger scale structures that get you?
I've already alluded to one of them, which is attention, right? So for more complex problems than the one I described, which is, looking at sequences of inputs coming in and deciding whether they're odd or even or something like that, you need to be able to select. And this is something that comes natural to us, when we look around. But also internally, you can only focus on one thing at a time, right? And words come out one at a time. So there's got to be some way to take this very highly parallel distributed representation, and then generate sequences.
Right. This is exactly the same story as my application of consciousness. It is a sequentialization in time. It is going from this multi-computational system to something which is a single thread. Now, actually, that idea of sequentializing, in our models of physics, that's done with reference frames. That's done with describing, the reference frames taken by the observer. Now, interestingly, quantum mechanics is a story of the scars that you get from the fact that it isn't in fact sequentialized. So in other words, that there is actually a multi-way structure. And so the question would be, when we think about brains and even the psychology of brains, is it the case that we can see kind of the scars, the shadows of the fact that what's happening isn't in fact truly sequentialized, the fact that there isn't just a single thread of attention, the fact that there could be some parallelization of attention? Is that because that's an example of something where if one could make a theory that talks about, there's usually the single thread, that would be like the classical physics, but actually there is also the possibility that there are these signs of the multi-way structure, so to speak, going on as well. Then one would end up with something, there would be a Planck's constant for the brain, basically.
Right.
Something where there's a deviation from perfect classicality, single attention thread. So is there a Planck's constant for the brain?
Okay, I don't know. but it just reminded me of a very peculiar illusion. It's called a flash lag illusion. Okay, flash lag is an illusion in which you have the illusion in which you're trying to, you have an annulus that's fixed, and you have a moving spot, and it flashes exactly in the middle of the annulus, but it's moving through it.
Right.
You do not see the flash in the middle of the annulus. You see it displaced. So that's a case where you're breaking down reality, because the reality is that it flashed in the middle, and you do not perceive it that way, right? So there's a mismatch between what your brain is reporting and what's really there, and so the theory was, and this is a very plausible theory, that, well, when something's moving along, you're predicting where it's going to be. It's moving. So you predict ahead, and that's what you see. It looks like it's a little bit ahead. Okay. So, about 15 years ago, I had a postdoc who did an experiment which proved that was wrong. It's a very simple experiment. And here's what you do. You have the same spot coming along, and it flashes just like in the normal flash lag effect. But instead of continuing to move forward, it goes backwards. It reverses. Now, the prediction theory states that you should see it as if it were advancing, right? Because you're making a prediction based on the input coming in at that moment. But what we showed, this is published in Science, was that no, you don't see that. You see it actually going in the opposite direction. The thing is now, to the opposite side, not the side it was going, but the opposite side, which is the side it actually went. Okay, so what this tells us, okay, and this is what got into Science, is that the brain is not in the business of predicting; it's in the business of post-dicting. It's reconstructing something on the basis of what you see now, on the basis of what comes in later.
Well, so is it in fact the case that if you asked somebody in real time, what are you seeing? In real time relative to what the stimulus, I mean, it could be that what people remember seeing is not what they actually saw in real time, so to speak. That is, that the formation of the thought lags the actual stimulus. Is that a possibility?
This is where things get murky, which has to do with that you're always asking the person to tell you after the fact what they saw, right?
Right.
And so how can you probe what they actually saw? And so now it gets even more murky. Okay, so now you go into the brain and say, can we sort it out by recording from the neurons? And what you find is that there are neurons that, first of all, have different latencies. Even in the same area of the cortex, the ones in the top will have different latencies from the time it takes for the information to first spike to get there, and from the bottom to the top. And then different areas in the hierarchy have different latencies and also different spiking patterns. In other words, there isn't any single time for perception. If you look at the level of the neurons, there are neurons that are being activated at many different times in different parts of the hierarchy. And somehow you reduce that to a percept. You reduce that to a single report, right? That's the mystery. And I think it's very similar to what you've described, which is that you at the micro level, there's all kinds of threads that are streaming through different parts of the cortex with different delays, but somehow that gets collapsed to your percept. And that's what we don't know. We don't know.
Right, but so the analogy one might expect is, from what we now understand about physics, the fact that there is a definite sort of thread of activity that is classical physics is something closely connected to the fact that we sequentialize things when we view what's happening in the world. And in fact, as I mentioned, there's this sort of shadow that is basically quantum mechanics. And so that really raises the question of, are there sort of a family of effects that you can imagine in the brain that are sort of essentially deviations from sequentiality of attention effects that are like quantum effects, so to speak, quantum in the sense of formalism, not quantum in the sense of quantum mechanics in the brain. And then the question would be, what, in that setting, what would characterize, just like in physics, there's a fixed constant, namely Planck's constant, that characterizes the amount of that sort of deviation from classicality. The question would be for brains, what is the constant of brains that, and perhaps it's something to do with what you're describing about these sort of different levels of well, I'm not sure, but maybe there's something that I don't know. That's okay. That's for another time. That's I think the well, listen, we should probably wrap up here, but
just to finish up the thought, okay, and you've raised some really important issues that are not the neuroscientists kind of they naturally, because they don't really know how to to operationalize it, they tend to stay away. Like consciousness is a good example of that. But it's, I think we're just like, consciousness is the tip of the iceberg, and there's all of these non-sequential threads are going on all over the brain all the time. It's called your unconscious, right?
Right.
You're not aware of it. You're not aware of it, but we know that it's important because a lot of things bubble up from,
right.
And in the strangest times, and then you suddenly get hit by a thought. Where did it come from? Well, it must have come from the brain somewhere, right? Some thread suddenly got promoted. In any case, I think that you have a good way of describing the mysteries of where we're at right now.
I mean, I think the thing that I'm really curious about is, imagine sometime in the future when there is, it's like for many different fields, physics is the unique case where people have global theories. It's a place where they don't exist in economics, they don't exist in, they don't exist in neuroscience. What would one imagine? What kind of a discussion would there be about the global theory of neuroscience? And I think that's the thing that, what kind of, because for example, in physics, it's not obvious the measurements that one chooses to do about which there are reasonable physical laws. It's not obvious what those measurements should be. And so similarly for neuroscience, I don't think it's necessarily obvious. It could be as soon as you start looking at the dimension reduced, activity of the neurons or whatever else, it will become kind of obvious that, the brain works in this way, but we just didn't look at the right features to be able to sort of see the obvious theory, so to speak. And so I guess I'm curious. I mean, I do think that some of the formalism that so the big bizarre thing that's happened with our model of physics is, because we have this underlying machine code model of physics, so to speak, and that the fact that we can relate it to physics, which has achieved a lot as a field, means that if we can take that same machine code and apply it in other areas, we get to leverage everything that physics has discovered. So, I mean, for example, in your life, working on, from physics to neuroscience, I'd be curious to know, the things you learned in physics, studying black holes and gravitational radiation and things like this, what have you used in neuroscience? I mean, you've used, some amount of differential equations, no doubt, but a lot of what you learned in physics, you have not been able to transport to neuroscience, I suspect. The theory of deep learning systems is mostly not a theory that you were able to transport from physics. The surprise now from some of what we're doing is that some of the formalism that we're getting from this sort of machine code from physics is, if we can use the same machine code, that higher level formalism is transportable. I'm curious, actually,
it might happen. Going to your issue of what have I used from physics, it's not specific, it's the tools. It's
Right.
the kind of the mathematics really that has been the most effective for it. But a particular theory for magnetism that hasn't translated, unless you're looking at.
But even the mathematics,
Right.
when you look at your average deep learning network and you say, I'm going to bash this thing on a GPU, there's not a heck of a lot of math of the traditional kind used in physics that tells you what's going to happen.
Well, okay, so, this is what people call explainability. Can you explain it? And the answer is not yet. But let's look at protein folding, right? This is like a holy grail in biology, and everybody is shocked that deep learning and DeepMind was able to achieve performance levels on new proteins, new sequences that approach X-ray crystallography. I mean, it's shocking because this is the classic problem of irreducibility, right? Everybody thought that you'd never be able to fold a protein without actually doing the mechanics of simulating the differential equations to get there.
Well, I think the question is, insofar as there are many postage stamps of proteins, so to speak, many distinct, the question is the space interpolatable? That is it the case that that the complexity of the space is such that with a limited number of postage stamps, you can successfully interpolate? I mean, I think that's
apparently so.
Apparently so, right.
In other words, the number of possible protein sequences is almost infinite, and the ones that are actually seen are a relatively small subset.
Well, that's a whole different question about whether the proteins that we actually use are random proteins or not. I looked at that several times now, and I've been kind of using that. It's when I run into somebody who knows about proteins, that is my standard question: is do you think that the proteins used by biology are randomly chosen or not?
Well, there's a lot of different answers to the question, but what you see is motifs that are used over and over again. And it turns out that there are substitutions you could make that don't change the function. So, right. It's a complicated answer.
But something like an alpha helix is very generic. I mean, once you have, just by the physics of protein structure, right. You're going to get alpha helices.
Yeah, that's alpha helices, beta sheets. So are these secondary structures that are very prototypical, that are found over and over again in all proteins. And it's pretty clear that's kind of part of the answer, is that, you have different scales with which you put together.
Right. But again, we're talking about, in protein space, what are the relevant features? And one thing is, you've got an alpha helix, you've got a beta sheet, as opposed to you've got and so, I mean.
But there's got to be more. And I'll tell you why, because of the fact that the protein has to have other features that are not as obvious, that allow it to be robust, to keep it folded, and to allow it to flex in certain ways, to bind to a particular spot. In other words, there's a lot of other things that the protein has to do to be viable. And they're not obvious, right? That's the point.
Right. Well, but yes, but right. But once you have evolved proteins that have certain attributes, the question is, do you have enough postage stamps to fill in?
Yeah. And apparently the answer is yes.
Right. Right, which is not obviously,
and that may be the biggest discovery, right? Because again, it wasn't obvious.
Right, and perhaps it, as you suggest, it points the way to kind of, in a sense, if we were to describe proteins, we have only certain features we know about, like alpha helices and so on. Perhaps there's really a different level of description. I mean, it's kind of like, one of the points of science is to say, of all these complicated things that's going on, is there some particular describable feature that we can attribute to things that we can then reason in terms of? Can we make a symbolic reduction effectively of this collection of disparate kinds of actual observations?
Explainability. My guess is that it will come, but not in the form of words. It will come in the form of mathematics. There'll be mathematical structures, maybe manifolds.
Well, that's a question, right? Whether it's traditional mathematics or whether it's computational.
Okay. I completely accept that. That there may be a computational abstraction that could
Right.
serve as the explanation, but
Right.
it's probably more. It's going to be very complex. By the way, I think we've gone beyond the hour and a half. And
Yeah, right. We have, and we
okay,
should
okay,
wrap up.
but no, it's
But
been fun.
I,
But before we leave, I have to remind you, Stephen, because you reminded me that you played a very important role in naming my book, The Deep Learning Revolution. I see in the shelf behind you a new kind of science. And I want to remind you of a discussion we had, because you at one point wanted to call it having to do with complexity, something or another, right?
Yeah,
Beatrice
I probably have behind me, I probably have the previous version, which was called The Science of Complexity.
Yes, okay. And I think it was Beatrice and I who convinced you that that probably was a generic title that you didn't want, right?
Well, I'll tell you one of the market study points. I mean, I remember talking about this, but one of the market study points was, if you say, I've got a book that's called The Science of Complexity, the next question people ask is, the next thing people say is, that sounds very complicated. If you have a book where the name is A New Kind of Science, people say, the first question they ask is, what's new about it? Which is, it is amusing that the title of that book is, people are like, it's now nearly 20 years since I wrote that book, and much about the basic computational paradigm that I tried to describe there has become pretty commonplace actually during that period of time. And people are like, they're like, what was the book about? And it's like, and eventually you realize that people say, well, you realize, well, what it was described by the actual title of the book, which is A New Kind of Science, so to speak. And people seem sort of a bit shocked that actually, when you loop back to it, that was actually the right title. I think that another thing I to comment on one of your comments to me in sort of developing that new kind of science is, what is its relationship to physics, for example? And I think I can attribute to you the claim, why don't you just do a leveraged buyout of physics, so to speak? Why don't you make the future of physics be that new kind of science? What's charming about that is, at the time, my statement was, the institutions of physics, it's too difficult to work with them. It's much easier just to build our own, so to speak. The irony of that story is, with what we've now figured out about physics, it turns out that that is sort of happening because the type of thinking that goes into new kind of science is the underlying part of the type of thinking that's gone into this new approach to physics, which it turns out plugs in very nicely to lots of things that people are thinking about in physics. So in the end, that I wouldn't call it a leveraged buyout of physics, but in the end, this kind of redefinition of what one should be studying in physics. In other words, if you're what kinds of modeling methodologies should you use? It's actually happening. But I think we'd sort of looped around to this point about explainability and what and having and sort of how you do those kinds of things. I'd like to point out that my main life activity of trying to define this computational language for describing the world is precisely about that. It's precisely about, can we find a symbolic description? It's not mathematics, it's a new kind of notation. I mean, the notation of mathematics is 400 years old. What we're trying to do is find a new, essentially computational notation for representing the world. And that's, in a sense, what you're asking for is, what is the computational notation that's relevant for neuroscience? And yes, that was the original question that I thought we were going to talk about here today. And we've managed to talk about a bunch of aspects of that. And I think that what's the appropriate computational notation for neuroscience? The machine code may be neural nets, but what is the higher level sort of description? You say it might be mathematical. That might be the case. It might be like general relativity, which is kind of mathematical and very manifold based. It might be something that is more like a computational language design problem. And but that's the thing I'd love to be able to solve is, what is the computational language description, or the higher level description of what one needs to be talking about in neuroscience. And
well,
we probably have to wait.
We're getting there. Stephen, our trajectories have gone in different directions, but I think they're coming back together. I think we have a
Yes,
common language here to describe a very complex, if I may use that word, systems.
Yes, right. No, I agree. It's interesting stuff. All right, we should wrap up here. Thank you very much, Terry. This was a great conversation. We covered lots and lots of different kinds of things, and we should come back and do it again sometime in the future once we've got the next few steps of figuring this all out.
I look forward to that. I had a lot of fun, and I really I think that you provoked me to really start thinking about this again, going back to our early discussions.
Yeah, right. Should happen.
Good.
Right.